Chapter 225. Time Element. Brando had considered this possibility before, but the way the time element manifests itself was a little strange. Time? Seems like it. In the game I've seen the time element before. No, it shouldn't be called the time element. It should be called the time element. However, it was also a legendary story of a shameless warrior who defeated a R&B warrior. It was one of the most popular legends among the players in the later stages of the game. He was fortunate enough to know everything about this existence. At least, he knew that the time rewind attribute was very similar to the situation he was in right now when it was under partial control. But whether or not it was completely the same was still up for debate. After all, the description of time element did not have words like stability. Brando sensed someone approaching him from behind. It was Scarlet. The red-haired girl was slightly injured in the previous battle. She limped behind him and silently unsheathed her sword and passed it to him. Brando stretched out his hand to receive the sword, but this time he did not rush to attack. Because just a moment ago his inspect skill, which had been activated all this time, notified him that a new, unfamiliar presence had appeared on the battlefield. Rothko? Rothko shouldn't be that strong. Is it a new enemy? Did they come to stop me from killing Cabias? Brando did not say a word as he looked at the skeleton that was struggling to get up from the dust. But after a few tries it would kneel down again. It was obvious that it was heavily injured. He then looked at Cornelius and his mercenaries. They were under the command of Medicia as they drove Grodin's private army towards the inner city. You're here. Brando purposely made himself relax and did not look at the girl beside him. You knew? Scarlet raised her head and looked at him in surprise. She had followed him here alone, but from Brando's tone, it was obvious that he had already noticed her presence. She lowered her head in silence. She knew that this young man was very opinionated when it came to certain matters. She had already thought of the possibility of his dissatisfaction when she acted alone. She thought that even the lovable merchant girl would not be able to reprimand her, let alone her. She did not say a word but made no attempt to refute him as long as he did not blame Sanford and the others. She was used to acting alone. She was used to being punished. She was used to the feeling of not being valued by others. I noticed it when you followed me out. Don't forget that the container for the blood of God is still with me. Brando smiled gently. Besides, with your personality, I would be surprised if you didn't follow me. How could this be? The red-haired girl frowned and looked at Brando in confusion. What are you thinking about now? Brando's gaze swept the surroundings as he asked, still motionless. The red-haired girl suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but stare at the latter vigilantly. My lord, don't go looking for trouble with Sanford and the others. I will take responsibility for my own actions. What are you thinking? Isn't that the case? Scarlet lowered her head and asked softly. Of course not. I'm keeping you in the team because you're Sanford's friend. That's why I've never treated you as my subordinate. As for what you think, I respect your choice. Aren't we teammates? No, we're just not subordinates. Scarlet lowered her eyes. Brando did not turn around to look at her. He thought he could guess what this girl was thinking. If it wasn't for the Grey Wolves mercenaries, she would have been more willing to find a secluded place and wait for death to come. Protecting others was also protecting herself, but it became the link between her and this world. Makarov had hurt her too deeply, and no one would be able to make up for it, let alone an outsider like him. But as an outsider he did not say much and changed the topic. Actually, it's not just me. Medicia and Cabias also know that you're nearby. The red-haired girl was stunned. Your life force is too strong and you don't know how to hide it. It's as bright as the sun in the eyes of the undead. But it? Scarlet asked. Brando saw that Cabias had shakily stood up from the rubble, but he did not seem to have any intention of attacking. He only looked at Scarlet and said, Cabias' axe was meant to force you out. I thought you could see that. I'm sorry. It's nothing, Brando replied. Thank you. Scarlet was slightly startled. She looked at the young man for a moment before lowering her head again. Brando suddenly shifted his gaze away from Cabias and looked at Medicia's direction. The silver fairy princess raised an eyebrow as if she sensed something. She turned her unicorn's head and raised her spear horizontally. The mercenaries immediately stopped. Even though their commander was still Cornelius, the silver elf's performance in the previous battle had deeply impressed them. Be it in terms of bravery or wisdom, even Cornelius himself had to admit that the gap between him and Medicia was too great. They originally thought that only Grodin's private army would participate in this battle, but now that Madara's army had joined the battle, they were at a loss for what to do. After all, the War of the Black Rose had just ended, and the fear of the undead army still lingered in everyone's hearts. Under such circumstances, they had no choice but to rely on those who could control the situation. For example, Medisha. And for example, Brando. My lord? Medisha's voice sounded in his mind. Are we not going to pursue? The undead still have reinforcements. Brando looked around. The aura that had been lying dormant on the battlefield had become obvious, but it was obvious that the enemy had not noticed that he had already discovered it. The young man looked in a certain direction and frowned slightly. The swaying black fog in the shadows caught his attention. What a high-level curtain of darkness. The young man's heart skipped a beat. Medisha, be careful. Brando shouted in his mind, but it was too late. A black shadow had already shot towards the silver fairy princess on the unicorn's back. Asterisk bang. Asterisk, the sharp sound of weapons clashing against each other was heard. Brando saw the silver elf being sent flying into the distance and landing in the middle of the crowd. Silver elf. After the black shadow succeeded in its attack, it let out a soft exclamation of surprise. However, it immediately retreated backwards like a black line that bounced off the surrounding buildings. After a few leaps, it finally landed in the middle of the road. Brendel finally saw the man's face clearly. The familiar black chainmail and cloak immediately made the young man suck in a breath of cold air. When his gaze fell on the scythe tightly gripped in the other's sharp metal gloves, his heart immediately sank. But what made his pupils contract the most was the strange metal mask that was laughing and crying at the same time. It was one of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse, the impartial judge Haku. Brando had expected that Madara and Groudon would send more people to the city after yesterday's conflict. But he did not expect that the one who appeared in front of him would be such a troublesome person. Of course, the title of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse did not exist in this era. However, among the 4 of them, the strongest one was the Green Knight, Malphas, who was currently the commander of the Plague Wolves army. As for the one he did not want to meet the most, it was the mysterious Black Knight, the impartial judge Haku. There was no other reason other than the fact that Haku was too shrewd. Not only was he powerful, but he was also an outstanding commander. With him here, Brando felt that his plan would be greatly reduced. He could not help but subconsciously look to the south and west. His plan would not be able to hide from this outstanding commander known as the Scales of the Battlefield, but fortunately, perhaps this was his only fortune. The opponent he feared the most had appeared in the chess game he was most confident in. Otherwise, it would be a headache to meet this person at the end of a chess game. He could not help but tighten his grip on the hilt of his sword. His palms were covered in cold sweat, but he had already made up his mind to keep Haku here tonight. Cabius could be dealt with as he pleased, but Haku had to stay. Haku? Tiamas? Chiyoyu? Brando forced himself to calm down and said, Madara's legendary Scales of the Battlefield. It seems that Tarkus, who is missing an eye, values me a lot. He actually sent his deputy. The battlefield fell silent as soon as he said that. The title, Scales of the Battlefield, was not well known in Erewhon, but Tarkus' deputy was a title that reverberated like thunder in everyone's ears. In fact, the mercenaries who were helping Medisa up almost dropped their weapons when they heard those words. Cabius, Tarkus' assistant, what was going on? Why did a name that only existed in legends appear in this desolate place tonight? It was as if they were rushing to the market. It was especially so for Cornelius. The silver-haired middle-aged man was trying his best not to let his face turn even paler. He thought he was on the right side at first, but now he looked at Brendel, and he could not help but regret it so much that his intestines turned green. Regardless of which side it was, he shouldn't have gotten involved in it at all. The Black Knight was also startled. It seems that you are very familiar with us. A magnetic voice came from under the metal mask. Human, you are not Viscount Gaston. You are also not Brando from Bucci. You said that you are a Highland Knight, but even a wizard from the Black Tower would not know so much about Madara. It seems that our investigation of you has completely failed, human. He sneered, but I have a personal guess. I suspect that you are one of the ancestors. Ancestors? Brando immediately heard Scarlet let out a soft, behind him. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 226. Clang. The battle axe was forced to clash with the longsword. Both man and undead were forced to retreat after clashing head-on. Cabius took a few steps back before stabbing its battle axe into the ground to stabilize itself. As for Brando, he crashed into the crowd behind him. What kind of skill is this? The tall skeleton leaned back to regain its balance, and immediately shouted in shock and anger. Although it did not understand how Brando was able to see through its attack, it could guess what was going on. "A technique that will take your life," Brando coldly replied. Taking advantage of Cabiaz's anger, Brando stood up and slashed at Cabiaz with his sword. The skill was unexpectedly useful, but it was also within his expectations. Only a skill like this was worthy of the title, Divine Skill, in his heart. Even though Brendel's speed was fast in the eyes of the bystanders, it was as slow as a tortoise in Cabiaz's eyes. Only when the long sword was about to pierce through its ribs did it pull its hands back, preparing to deal a heavy blow to Brando. The white lines around Cabiaz's body suddenly changed and formed a new net. "My lord." The Silver Fairy Princess turned around and saw this scene. Brando also realized that his sword had missed. But a miracle happened. A figure like a flame appeared in front of everyone's eyes. Clang. The spear of lightning, Logos, suddenly appeared between the two, firmly blocking Cabiaz's pitch-black battle axe. At that moment, everyone saw a long, dazzling red ponytail fluttering in the night sky. The red-haired girl leaned back slightly, but she held on tightly to the hilt of her halberd to stabilize herself. Scarlet lowered her head, her amber eyes filled with calmness. On the other side of her there was another loud sound. Time seemed to have stopped, and Brendel's sword accurately struck Cabiaz's right chest. The impact from the explosion created a turbulence in the armor behind the steel-like ribs, causing the air to swirl and break through the thin barrier of the skeleton. Cabiaz could feel that at least 3 of his ribs were broken. Then it roared as it was sent flying. "That's impossible." This thought took root in the minds of Brendel, Cabiaz, and even the Silver Elf Princess who was watching from afar. How is this possible? The 3 of them clearly felt that Brendel's sword had missed, and Cabiaz had dodged to the side, but when Brendel's sword came into contact with his body, they realized that Cabiaz's sword was about to hit him. Cabiaz's body was still in its original position. Was it an illusion? But Brando had subconsciously used all his strength to press down on the long sword, and a white frost spread out from his sword, forming a radiant curtain of frost in front of him. Cabiaz was sent flying by the icy wind, crashing heavily onto the ground. Along with its brass armor, it was sent flying for a few rounds before finally coming to a stop after crashing into a wall. With a loud bang, smoke and dust flew everywhere. There was a cracking sound. The long sword cracked and then it shattered into pieces. Brando held on to the hilt, forgetting to continue his attack. What he saw just now was not an illusion. With his level 130 combat experience, he would not make such a ridiculous mistake in a low-level brawl. Did he see wrongly? Was it even possible for a level 130 warrior to do that? He threw away the sword hilt and pulled out another sword from a nearby noble's corpse. It was awkward to say that these common longswords could no longer withstand his gold-rank strength. He missed the Thorn of Light very much. Although it was a low-level weapon, it was still a magic weapon. Cabiaz stood up shakily from the ruins. Although the previous attack was not enough to injure it, it was not in a good state. Brando had just stepped into the gold-ranked realm, but his strength was still at the level of a low-level gold-ranked warrior. When he used his full strength, not everyone could block it with their chest. But the undead general pressed on the wound on its chest, and it did not have the time to complain. In its vision, 2 figures, one red and one black, were closing in. This was a good tactic, but it was too slow. Cabiaz gritted its teeth and took a step back, raising its battle axe with both hands. It used all its strength to push forward, and 2 ear-piercing metallic screeches pierced through the battlefield. The mercenaries could not help but cover their ears subconsciously. Power burst. Brando did not expect the skeleton to be able to use such a move. By the time he reacted, Scarlet had already been sent flying with her spear. At the same time he felt a huge force surging into his hand, and as he fell backwards, he could only watch helplessly as the blank long sword and Cabiaz's battle axe turned into countless metal fragments that scattered in the air. The young man immediately covered his eyes with his hand, and the metal fragments flew towards him and Cabiaz. Clang, 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 clang. Brando felt a piercing pain in his hand. His clothes and trousers were also turned into sieves. But what made him even more shocked was that his strength was not on par with Scarlet's. Then why was the red-haired girl sent flying, while he was only knocked down and had his weapon shattered? Cabiaz did it on purpose. His eyes twitched and he saw the tall skeleton throw away its battle axe. At the same time, a dazzling metallic light appeared in its claws. The undead general sneered, and in its claws was a short spear, thrusting towards Brando's shoulder. A layer of blood-red mist appeared on the short spear, and it moved forward like a straight line of blood. A magical weapon. It was too fast, and Brando, who was falling to the ground, had no time to dodge. Cabias used all its strength to stab downwards, and it could almost imagine the young man's miserable screams. But in the next moment, it found that it had stabbed nothing but air. The tall skeleton subconsciously raised its head. Brando was still holding his right hand with his left hand, and the silver ring of the Wind Empress on his right index finger was facing the ground. He smiled triumphantly at Cabias. In fact, when he first saw that Cabias's battle axe was not a magical weapon, he was certain that its main weapon was not a battle axe. He had been waiting for this skeleton to bare its fangs, but he did not expect it to be full of tricks. Just as the short spear was about to hit him, Brando decisively used the ring of the Wind Empress to launch a wind bullet at the ground. The huge recoil sent him flying. The impact of a silver-ranked warrior's attack was not enough to deal much damage to him, but it was enough to change his direction as he fell to the ground. Just like that, the tables had turned. Cabias raised its head, and saw Brando pulling out a short sword from his boot with a smile. While in midair, Brando used the momentum of his fall to slash at it. Although the tall skeleton was shocked and angry, its reaction was not slow at all. It immediately dodged and prepared to counterattack. But at that moment the same thing happened again. Cabias clearly felt that it had dodged the attack, but when the dagger fell, it still accurately hit its bald skull. How is this possible? It was about to roar in anger, but a loud bang suppressed its roar, and the Lord of the Darkness was sent flying again. Brando used the momentum to roll and landed on the ground before pouncing forward once more. He did not have time to confirm the strange feeling from before, and wisely chose to give up on using Power Burst to avoid damaging the weapon in his hand. Cabias roared and rolled to the side, trying to get up and counterattack. But what made it even more furious was that even though it had rolled away, the short sword still hit it in its original attack path. In fact, everyone on the battlefield saw an unforgettable scene. The young man, Viscount Gaston, was the true leader of Leto and the others. Or rather, he was just a young knight. Holding a short sword in his hand, he swung it left and right at Cabias. It was as if Cabias had rehearsed his moves beforehand. No matter how the tall skeleton tried to dodge, he was still sent flying by Cabias's simple slashes. It was no longer a battle, but more like a father beating his son. However, was that undead really the legendary gold-ranked god of death, Cabias? Or is that young man actually a knight of the Holy Cathedral who is hiding his identity? A 20-year-old knight of the Holy Cathedral? Not only the mercenaries on the battlefield, even the noble soldiers who saw this scene from afar were a little confused. Dear Martha, who can tell us who this person is? However, Brando's terrifying strength caused Grodin's private army to crumble. What a joke. Gold-ranked existences could be suppressed by numbers, but once they activated their element power, they were already inhuman beings. In front of an inhuman being, they would only be cannon fodder to stall for time. No one was willing to fight a hopeless battle, and the noble soldiers who gathered for power and wealth were even more unwilling. After Brando's last strike, the short sword in his hand finally shattered. He watched as Cabias was sent flying like a sandbag and crashed into a building. He could not help but let out a long sigh and threw away the hilt in his hand. He had tried his best to use as little strength as possible, but the sword could only withstand 10 strikes in the end. However, he did not care about that right now. He was immersed in a strange feeling. Just like what he saw before, if 1 or 2 occurrences could be called an illusion, then what about 10 occurrences? But the problem was, be it Cabias or even Scarlet who was at the back, all of his attacks had clearly landed on the skeleton's body. Every single time, his sword would strike empty air, but in the end, it still landed on the skeleton's body. What's going on? He raised his head and was about to switch to another sword to continue his attack, but at that moment he heard a mournful roar from the ruins in front of him. Damn bastard, this is the power of an element. What kind of element is this? Cabias's sorrowful roar reverberated throughout the battlefield. Brendel was slightly taken aback. Element power? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 227. An element? Brando had never heard of such an element before. Even though karma reversal, time reversal, and spatial displacement could all achieve similar effects. However, the first description of logic, cause and effect, is order, regularity, and time is only related to the relative motion of objects, and the process of reversal cannot be related to it by oneself. The gold element's power was uncontrollable, and it had to be controlled by time reversal, so time reversal could be ruled out. There were too many definitions of space, and space alone had several meanings, and it had a lot of intersections with time reversal. Order and stability seemed to be used to describe space, but space had countless subdefinitions such as displacement, vector, motion, and even matter and spirit. However, spatial displacement was related to displacement, and had nothing to do with stasis or stability. As for the subtypes of elements such as karma reversal, light refraction, curved path, and illusion, none of them could lower the temperature of the material world, let alone order and stability. Brando sensed someone approaching him from behind, and a faint fragrance wafted into his nose. It smelled like the leaves of a certain tree in the hills south of Erewhon, and he knew that Scarlet often wore such leaves in her hair. He did not need to turn around to feel the red-haired girl walking to his side. She looked straight ahead and unsheathed her sword, which she did not use often, and silently handed it to him. "Here," Scarlet said. "Thank you." Brendel took the sword and saw Cabiaz's towering figure standing up from the rubble with a clatter of rocks falling to the ground. The undead lord glared at them hatefully. Brando's elemental power made it suspicious. Its elemental power was soul force, which was used to strengthen its attack and defense. It was completely suppressed by the young man's elemental power, and it did not dare to act rashly. Even though the mercenaries under Medish's command charged towards Grodin's private army, Cabiaz could only stand there and face Brando. It was originally confident in its victory, but now it was even worried that the mysterious young man would take the initiative to attack. The skeleton pressed the wound on its brass armor, not sure if it could really block Brando's attack. It knew that the situation could not be changed, but at least it wanted to keep Brando here. "Do we defeat it?" Scarlet asked as she gripped her halberd tightly. Brando shook his head. He wasn't sure either. The elemental power was erratic and uncontrollable. On the other hand, Cabiaz was far stronger than him. It could afford to make a mistake, but he could not. If he misjudged the effects of his element power and allowed Cabiaz to seize the opportunity to counterattack, the price he would have to pay was not something he could bear. The young man had long put aside his life and death, but in his position he had to be responsible for more people. Death was simple, but it was the choice of a coward. "Its attack just now was to force you out. I thought you could see it." Brando replied he was talking about Scarlet blocking the axe for him. "I'm sorry," Scarlet suddenly reacted and looked at him in surprise. You knew?" But she had clearly followed him alone. She was so far away in the forest. Besides, she also had experience in hiding in the forest. She clearly remembered that he was holding Sifrid's hand and walking far ahead without looking back. She suddenly shut her mouth and looked at Brando suspiciously. She suspected that Brando was trying to trick her. "I noticed it when you came out with me," Brando replied, "the vessel for the god's blood." Scarlet lowered her head. In her eyes, this young lord was used to controlling everything and doing things his own way. Even the lovable merchant girl was not something he could reprimand, let alone her. But she had thought it through before acting rashly. She was used to being reprimanded, at least compared to being ignored. She took a deep breath and suddenly thought of another possibility. Is he trying to shift the blame onto Sanford and the others? The more she thought about it, the more she felt that it was possible. She raised her head and looked at him vigilantly. "What are you thinking about?" Brando could see the obvious suspicion in her eyes. "I'm taking responsibility for my actions." Scarlet frowned and said, "Responsibility?" Brando looked at the motionless Cabiaz. "Are you the one who can afford to wait, or am I the one who can afford to wait?" However, he wasn't in a hurry and simply chatted with Chen Qian. But his nonchalant attitude made Scarlet think that he would take his anger out on the Grey Wolves mercenaries. She could not help but feel uneasy. She did not think that her actions would cause trouble for others. Scarlet gritted her teeth. Anything is fine. She was an orphan who grew up in a mercenary group. But she was also familiar with the rumors of the nobles. Brando was slightly startled and looked at her. Scarlet blushed, and even the tips of her ears were burning. She seemed to have used all her strength to say those words. "Anything is fine, my lord, but please don't cause trouble for them." "Ha! Isn't that enough?" Scarlet gritted her teeth and asked. "What?" Brando was puzzled. "Them? Who are they?" "Sanford and everyone else. Why would I cause trouble for them?" Scarlet was stunned. She raised her head and looked at Brando with her amber eyes, as if trying to discern if he was telling the truth. Because, she realized that she had blurted out something, but immediately shut her mouth. Brando suddenly understood what she was talking about and smiled. "With your personality, I would be surprised if you didn't follow me." Is that so? Scarlet asked in an almost inaudible voice. She turned her head away again. You make it sound like I'm an idiot. No, Brando shook his head. I'm just respecting your choice. Then what about the others? Scarlet's eyes flashed. Everyone has their own responsibilities and obligations. Just like how a person can be willful but they can't be willful all the time. Brando replied, I respect their choice as well, but after making a choice, what's left is the responsibility of that choice. Impulse can control a person's actions, but the difference between idealism and naivety is whether a person truly understands what they have to pay for it, and what they are willing to pay for it. So I'm sure you won't choose to run away here, right? Scarlet nodded. She looked at the shadow cast by Abby's castle and said fiercely, if you want me to back down in front of that scum, you might as well kill me. So, our attitudes are the same. Brando smiled bitterly. We're on the same side, fighting side by side. Why would I blame you? Scarlet lowered her eyes. In the end, I'm still an outsider. Brando looked at her and suddenly realized what she was thinking. Of course, he wanted her to become his subordinate. A gold-ranked fighter would attract attention no matter where she went. But this was not a bad thing. She could slowly integrate into the group and their relationship would be more stable. He had never intended to give up on Scarlet, but using the other members of the Grey Wolves mercenaries to threaten a girl was not his hobby. So he just smiled. The battlefield was silent for a moment. Brando looked at Cabia's huge bony claws holding the short spear. Of course, from a normal person's point of view, it was no different from a normal spear. The soul fire in the undead lord's eye sockets was still burning. The youth knew that Cabia's had made up its mind to keep him here. He looked at the battlefield absent-mindedly and simply said, Scarlet. Yes. Go support Medisha, okay? Leave this to me. Scarlet nodded and raised her spear. She looked at Cabia's, who was shrouded in the mist, and took 2 steps forward before stopping. Just give orders. The girl's voice softly said. Brando was slightly startled and looked up. But the red-haired girl's figure had already disappeared into the dust-filled street. Brando was stunned for a moment before he smiled. He then looked at Cabia's again. Both of them did not move. While Brando and the undead lord were confronting each other, Medisha was in trouble on the other side of the battlefield. The mercenaries continued to drive Grodin's private army into the inner city. Relying on their superior combat strength and willpower, Grodin's unhindered attack was met with trouble as they approached Abby's castle. This was the last line of defense for the noble's private army, but Grodin's soldiers were not the only ones standing behind the defense line. There were also rows of skeletons that glowed with a faint light under the moonlight. These skeletons were very different from the ones he saw in Bucci. Compared to the normal skeletons, they wore light leather armor, held short spears in their hands, and had short swords and small round shields at their waists. Each of them carried 3 to 4 bone spears on their backs. They stood quietly behind the defensive line, motionless. But in fact, in the short period of time that they had come into contact with the mercenaries, they had caused great losses to the mercenaries. If Brando was here, he would be able to tell that these undead were Madara's elite bone thorns. These skeletons were the assault team of the low-ranked undead, and were Tarkus's famous personal guards. They could even be called the high-ranked existences among the low-ranked undead. As a matter of fact, wherever they were, Tarkus or the high-ranking generals around him should be there. For example, at this moment, the female knight was standing in front of the knight with a huge scythe in her hand and a long black cloak. Among the 4 knights of the apocalypse, the most powerful one was the Green Knight, Malphas, who was currently the commander of the Plague of Wolves. However, the most taboo and mysterious person was none other than the Black Knight, the impartial Judge White. He raised his head, and the expression on his metal mask formed a strange symbol, but the pair of golden eyes fell on Medisha. Who are you? Medisha frowned slightly. She had fought with him before and instinctively felt that he was powerful. Silver Elf. The Black Knight Eamon was slightly startled, and his magnetic voice was surprised. You are with that person too? You are really unfathomable. He is neither Viscount Gaston nor Brando of Bucci. He claims to be a Highland Knight, but it is impossible for a wizard of the Black Tower to have such an understanding of Madara. In my opinion, he is more like one of the ancestors. Ancestor? The Silver Fairy Princess was stunned for a moment, but Eamon raised his head. His eyes reflected a beam of fire in the south. That was a magic signal rising into the sky. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 228. A ray of magic light pierced through the darkness and rose to the sky. The light illuminated the vast land, and the edge of the light changed on top of the ruins, outlining the outline of the ruins of the south gate of Abes. The cold face of Vern, the leader of the Fire Lord, was constantly changing under the light. The tall man crossed his hands on the hilt of his sword, which was carved with the head of a demon, and stood motionless in the darkness. His heavy eyes looked straight ahead. The forest on the horizon seemed to form an inky line in the darkness, and the fog formed a thin layer of night mist. But on the other side of the darkness, a row of rustling footsteps gradually came from afar. It was as if the footsteps came from hell. However, it was a huge army marching forward in unison. The sexy and beautiful mercenary leader with fiery long hair did not guess it right. Vern had never become Erwin's knight. But there was a long scar on his neck which came from his past memory. He was actually a retired cavalryman who fought against Madara in Karsuk. So when he closed his eyes, he could almost tell from the depths of his soul where the rustling sound came from. Madara's army was like an ocean, boundless and endless, an endless skeleton army. Rows after rows of skeletons' footsteps fell on his heartstrings. Sparks of red fire appeared in the darkness, and there were more and more of them like will-o'-the-wisps drifting behind the fog. The mercenaries picked up their weapons and stood up from the ruins with a solemn expression. More and more people gathered behind a temporary fortification built on the ruins. Heads moved about but no one spoke. Their voices seemed to be swallowed up by the approaching drumbeats. Everyone held their breaths as they watched the scene unfold before them. The army of the undead slowly emerged from the darkness. Some people came to Vern's side. They were the subordinates of the Fire Lord. Even a few wizards in the Fire Lord were included. In the past they had always acted as the brains of the mercenary group. But they were hesitant about whether this battle was worth fighting or not. The key question was whether they were willing to offend the young Viscount. But at this moment, when they saw the army of skeletons coming out of the darkness like a tide, they couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. That was Madara. The bright roses and thorns in the darkness represented an irresistible aura, as if everyone had to face the aura of death in the end. Leader? Under the hood, the Magus revealed half of his pale face as he asked in a low voice. Vern said nothing. Commander, there are a few thousand of them, he reminded in a low voice. Including the rest of us, there are only a little over 200 of them. What's more, there's no way we can trust anyone outside the group. Are we really going to fight to the death with these skeletons just because of a promise? Even if we have to sacrifice all of our brothers? Where can you escape to? I know their habits better than you do. This city is now surrounded on all sides. I learned a lesson in Karsuk. Never try to guess how many undead there are because there will always be more than you can imagine. The tall man looked back at him and said, I know their habits better than you do. This city is now surrounded on all sides. He raised his head and looked at the front. Although there are many of them, they are just low-level skeletons. They were just summoned from the graveyard not long ago. As long as we can hold on until the day comes, they will naturally retreat. Leader? Fern raised his hand and interrupted the Magus. Our only hope now is that young lord. 2 gold-ranked beings are enough to lead us out of this encirclement. Send out a magic signal. Tell the young lord that in 2 hours the Fire Lord mercenary group will not retreat until they are dead. The tall man waved his hand. Raise the flag of the Fire Lord mercenary group. Even if I die, I want to see it fluttering under the light of dawn. Since that young noble wants us to hold on until dawn, then let me see how the first ray of light pierces through the heavy darkness. Fern replied. He knew Brando's plan very well. If he can do it, I don't care if I am the leader or not. The Magi were stunned and looked at each other. 2 hours later. It was the dawn. The first ones? Medisha stopped and frowned. The girl held her spear and turned her horse's head. Every nerve in her body was tense as she looked at the undead general who stood in front of the defensive line built by the undead. He was wearing a black cloak with a silver scale drawn on it. He was emitting a cold aura from head to toe. She did not know why he would suddenly say something like that. But before the era of the first ones, there was a legend in the ancient myths. In the dark and turbulent era, the Azure Knight led the first batch of first ones out of the sanctuary and defeated the Twilight Dragon, which was known as the Final Calamity. Then the Year of Chaos began. But how could the Lord be one of the first ones? Other than the dragons, the bloodline of the Golden Generation had long been lost on the earth and even became a legend. Even the descendants of the Silver Ones were known as proud existences before this era. And after the era of the Dark Dragon's rampage, the bloodline was scattered on the earth. Even the survival of the silver ones became uncertain. How could there still be first ones walking on the earth? Unless Brando was a dragon. But the elven girl immediately shook her head and denied this suspicion. Even if the dragon was just a newborn, it would not be as weak as the Lord. Although she thought so, the girl suddenly felt a little sorry for Brando. She blushed and quickly apologized in her heart. But she turned her horse's head and asked coldly, "Nonsense, what do you mean?" Haku raised his head. The cold metal mask was half crying and half laughing, but the pair of golden eyes under the mask made Medisha feel a little strange. The undead held the scythe motionless. The silver elf girl quickly blinked her eyes, afraid that she would be charmed by him. The masked man, one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse, laughed in a low muffled voice. "Just like what I said before, the meaning on the surface is as you understand." The Black Knight's voice was filled with a metallic echo. "Nonsense." Medisha looked around. The undead general in front of her was far stronger than she imagined. But when she stopped, the mercenaries' attack also stopped. The elven girl did not know whether to ask the Lord for reinforcements. Because of the battle between Brando and Cabias, the streets were covered in a thick layer of smoke. She did not know what happened behind the scenes, but she was worried that she would distract Brando. But in this stalemate, the noble's private soldiers were also not allowed to enter the city. Since that was the case, she might as well delay for a while. She bit her pale silver lower lip and said, "The golden bloodline has long been lost. How can there still be first ones walking on the earth?" Haku smiled and quietly replied, "Indeed, the first ones were golden ones. But Miss Elf, you have forgotten that there is still the existence of the Fool." The silver fairy princess could not help but smile. "The dark dragon? That's funny. You think the Lord is the dark dragon? What's the point of such a lie? No one will believe it. It's meaningless." Haku shook his head. "But in Madara, there is a legend that says, the Lord of Darkness will return. He can see through the hearts of people and understand all things. You must have heard of this ancient legend because it was passed down from the black prophecy of the Myurnas. They are your mortal enemies, right?" "So what? It's nothing. I just met a witch called Babasha in Fortress Reeden." Haku replied as if he did not care, "You know, the witches are more sensitive to the power of darkness than the average person." The silver fairy princess shook her head. "But you must have forgotten that the dark dragon was once our race's greatest enemy. Compared to the witches, I am more familiar with his aura. Not to mention, there is also a passage in the Black Prophecy that says, darkness will be born from the inhuman, and the glorious people will perish in the flames. The Lord is a human, a descendant of the flame king Gretel. He is the descendant of the glorious people. You can't deny this, can you?" "That's true." Haku picked up his scythe and nodded to himself. "Stop trying to sow discord. Who are you?" The opponent did not seem to mind that she was stalling for time. Medisha felt uneasy. She had decided to attack again. If there was nothing she could do, she could only ask for the Lord's help. A chuckle came from under the metal mask. "I remember I said that my name is Haku. Haku Tiamash Chiyoyu is my name. I am the scales of war, the just judge of the hearts of people." The undead general put one hand on his chest and bowed slightly. "You are the instigator and the instigator," Medisha said coldly. She raised her spear, but the opponent was faster than her. Just as she was about to attack, Haku lowered his head as if he had seen it with his own eyes. He held the scythe on his back and swung it forward. A black light swept towards Medisha. The fairy princess was shocked. She clenched her teeth and retreated, but she was still hit by the end of the attack. The black light collided with the soul barrier around her body and exploded into a dazzling light. The airflow swept in all directions. The mercenaries nearby all retreated. The girl groaned and was also injured. A very strong soul power. As expected of a silver elf's ghost. Haku looked at the soul fire shining around Medisha's body and replied. At the same time he raised his hand. The bone thorn column immediately moved forward. They took out the bone spears on their backs and entered an attacking stance. At the same time, the mercenaries were still being beaten up by the previous attack. They did not have time to care about anything else. Medisha, who was holding back her injuries, looked up and saw this scene. Panic flashed in her pale silver eyes. She clenched her teeth and shouted, "No!" But the undead general had already put down his hand coldly. There was a soft sound. The sound of the air vibrating echoed in her ears for a long time. A row of bone spears flew into the air. The panic in the eyes of the silver elf turned into determination in an instant. The little princess pressed her hand in front of her chest and shouted, "Tayuna!" Ancient elf language, Wings of the spirit? Her voice was like a string of pleasant chimes that penetrated the entire battlefield in an instant. At the same time, everyone saw the soul fire around the young knight's body explode in an instant. It was like a pair of huge wings that spread out. Once the soul power was spread out, it lingered in the night sky and formed layers of transparent hexagonal network against the dark background. In an instant, the entire street was under the protection of the fairy princess's wings. The bone spears fell from the sky and landed on the transparent crystal network. Every time they hit, there would be a burst of dazzling light. But almost every bone spear was blocked and turned into ashes in an instant. The mercenaries looked up. The flashing light shone on their faces. But no matter what, they knew that they were saved. Haku looked at the scene quietly. His golden eyes flashed, ancient silver elf battle technique. He smiled and leveled the scythe in his hand. After the soul fire spread out, Medisha no longer had any protection around her. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 229. Medisha did not think too much when she opened her wings of spirit. She was like a general protecting her subordinates. But when she saw the black-clothed undead general looking at her quietly, she realized that she had done something wrong. It stretched out its right hand and held the huge black scythe in its spiked metal glove, and gently placed it down. Haku disappeared from her sight in the next moment. The silver elf instinctively pulled her spear back, but it was too late. She looked up, and the radiance on her wings of spirit dimmed. It was a cold scythe that blocked the light, and a black ray of light was drawn from the scythe from top to bottom. Crack. The silver chainmail shattered into pieces and fell to the ground like flickering leaves. Rose-colored blood bloomed like a bright red flower. Medisha looked at the wound that extended from her shoulder to her lower abdomen in disbelief. Her face was pale. When the undead general landed, he reached out his hand from under his black cloak and grabbed her by the throat. He pushed her forward and threw the silver elf off the unicorn like a kite with a broken string. She fell to the ground with a thud. A cloud of dust rose. The Dark Knight landed on the ground at the same time. There was not a trace of emotion under his cold metal mask. He calmly swung his scythe forward. The crescent-shaped scythe cut out a perfect semicircle. The wind pressure was like a knife that swept out in all directions. The mercenaries who had come to their senses and wanted to help the female knight were sent flying. The mercenaries screamed and retreated. It was as if the scythe had swept through straw. When Haku landed on the ground, a vacuum semicircle with a radius of 10 meters formed around him. The unicorn stood in front of Medisha, but the undead general knocked it to the ground. He looked down at the girl lying on the ground. Medisha was lying quietly in a pool of blood. Her pale silver eyes were a little unfocused. The girl coughed up blood occasionally. The bright red blood flowed down her fair, slender neck and formed eye-catching red spots. The girl could barely feel her own body. She could only feel the pain spreading along her nerves. A kind of exhaustion gradually took over her mind. Her consciousness seemed to be fading away. However, in her darkening vision, the girl saw the cold mask magnifying. Haku squatted down beside her and grabbed her by the throat with one hand. "Medisha, you still haven't improved," Haku said. The silver elf princess trembled and coughed out a mouthful of blood. "Cough, cough, you dash," she struggled to squeeze out the words, only to see that Bai had closed one of his eyes, and the other was burning with golden flames as he looked at her motionlessly. Mind reading. Damn it, the girl clenched her teeth and focused. Her remaining soul energy sealed the space around her body like flowing water. Although mind reading could only read one's thoughts on the surface, it was still despicable. In the circle of upper-class wizards, only the filthy and despicable people would use such a trick. However, mind reading was widely spread among the dark nobles in Madara. Medisha was not familiar with these undead creatures who lived in the shadows. If Brando was here, he would at most laugh. However, the fairy princess was trembling with anger as if she was greatly humiliated. The scythe-wielding undead general shook his head. Cough, cough. I can't. Medisha shook her head weakly as if she was trying to break free from the general's grip. She felt her consciousness fading away. Then she felt a cold sensation on her neck. The spiked metal glove was strangling her throat, making her feel very uncomfortable. She knew she could not hold on any longer, but she had to warn her lord. Haku looked at her motionlessly. There was a kind of pity in his golden eyes. The silver elf fairy princess trembled. She immediately felt as if there was an invisible wall on the battlefield that bounced back her telepathic thoughts. Her telepathic connection with Brando was cut off. Cough cough. Medisha coughed painfully. There are many ways to use the soul element. The undead of Madara have a lot of knowledge on how to use it. I am no exception. Haku held the fairy princess' neck tightly as if he was catching a bird. He replied coldly, soul barrier, absolute seal. In this space that I created, I can cut off all connections with the material world. If you want to enter or leave, you must have power that surpasses mine. Haku's voice stopped abruptly. He suddenly turned around. He raised his hand to block in a certain direction. A fiery red figure shot out like a flame from the ground. It was mixed with galloping lightning. Bang! Several long arcs of lightning flashed in the darkness. Haku groaned. However, Scarlet had already exchanged blows with his left hand with her spear. Then she quickly retreated. There is another gold-tier existence. The undead knight stared at the red-haired girl standing in the distance and said, that young man has many capable subordinates. Let her go. Scarlet looked at Medisha and Haku's hand and gritted her teeth. Bai Lung snorted coldly. He threw Medisha aside and swung his scythe at Scarlet. The red-haired girl was slightly stunned. She felt that Haku had suddenly disappeared from her sight. But in the next moment, the cold scythe had already touched her neck. The cold aura of the scythe brought with it a sharp pain. Scarlet's heart went cold. When she rushed over from afar, she saw the scene of Haku and Medisha fighting. She originally thought that was Haku's true strength. But compared to this moment, she did not expect that he was actually holding back. This undead strength was beyond her imagination. According to the young man, this undead was at least at the peak of gold tier. In fact, only those at the peak of gold tier would be able to grasp the basic method of activating their elemental powers. But the spiritual barrier was invisible, so Scarlet did not know that she had missed the best chance to estimate Haku's strength. Scarlet gritted her teeth and dodged to the side to avoid being hit by the scythe's sharp edge. The moment the scythe touched her body, she let out a muffled groan as she was sent flying. Even though the attack was much heavier than Medusa's, the red-haired girl was still able to get up quickly with her hands on her shoulder. The Oracle's natural defense and regenerative abilities were far stronger than the weak elves. Haku was slightly stunned. He thought that his attack with 80% of his strength should have killed Scarlet. He did not expect her to get up as if nothing had happened. But if this Black Knight, one of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse, knew that this girl with a long red ponytail was able to recover after being hit by Ekman, a monster who had activated his elemental powers, and was lying down for a week, then he would have used his full strength in that attack. The moment the two of them exchanged blows, they left the empty space where Medusa was. This was undoubtedly the best opportunity, but the mercenaries were cowering after the previous loss and no longer dared to move forward. Scarlet gritted her teeth and looked at these guys, her amber eyes seemed to be burning with flames. However, the leader of the Rose and Wine mercenary group, Cornelius, was currently hesitating. His slender silver hair was covered in sweat. The enemy's strength was beyond his imagination, and his confidants were also advising him to leave. But that young man was not someone to be trifled with. Not only was he a descendant of a noble, but he also had many gold-ranked fighters under him. No one would believe that he did not have a strong background. However, when he raised his head, he immediately saw the elite skeleton spear throwers under the command of the undead knights. They began to surround the heavily injured Medusa in the center of the battlefield. The undead were like a tide. Cornelius gritted his teeth and finally made up his mind. If they disobeyed Brendel's orders, they might be killed, but now they had to face a more realistic threat. The undead were obviously stronger, and the masked Black Knight had injured Medusa and Scarlet. That was a fact that everyone had witnessed. He sheathed his sword and was about to give the order to retreat, but just as he was about to take a step back, he felt his clothes being grabbed by a small hand. It was the little girl. The silver-haired middle-aged man lowered his head and saw Sifrid looking at him with a pair of deep emerald eyes. "Uncle?" she asked in a small voice. Cornelius was startled. He knew what Sifrid was trying to say, but how should he answer her? Should he tell her that his uncle was preparing to escape? He opened his mouth but found that he could not say anything. Sifrid's serious expression reminded him of his daughter. His wife and daughter had died in the chaos. Erewhon's borders had been chaotic for decades, and almost everyone who lived there had experienced the hardships of war. The middle-aged man closed his eyes, his forehead covered in cold sweat. "Leader?" his confidant asked. Cornelius opened his bloodshot eyes. "Let's take a gamble." Everyone around him was stunned. "Let Martha win or lose," Cornelius said through gritted teeth. Let Martha win or lose. The mercenaries finally made their move. They charged forward and collided with the rows of skeletons. The battle began in an instant. The mercenaries who were closest to Medusa immediately formed a human wall to protect the elven princess. They helped her up from the pool of blood. Medusa shook her head as she realized the situation she was in. But she immediately remembered that she still had one last chance to change the situation on the battlefield. Medusa took a deep breath. Scarlet and Haku crossed paths. When she was wounded for the third time, she suddenly heard the mercenaries shouting at her from behind. The red-haired girl stubbornly wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth. When she turned around, she heard the mercenaries shouting at her, "Attack that guy with all your might." Attack with all my might. What do they mean? Scarlet was stunned for a moment, but she quickly saw Medusa sitting in the middle of the crowd. The silver fairy princess's eyes were almost unfocused, but there was a glimmer of hope burning in her eyes. She immediately understood what they meant. Attack with all my might? She raised her halberd, and a dazzling arc of light appeared at the tip of the lightning spear. The red-haired girl brandished her halberd and blocked the approaching undead knight. Aku was stunned. Scarlet leveled her halberd, and in an instant, countless lightning bolts appeared around her body. Even her red ponytail was disheveled, and her hair fluttered in the wind. She stared at the undead knight, revealing her canine teeth as she chuckled. The lightning around her body immediately coiled around her halberd. Seventh string, sound of thunder. Author's note: I've been waiting for a long time for this novel to be promoted. I hope that my fellow students will support me. Please praise me in the comments section. Chapter 230. The intense flash of light even penetrated the barrier formed by Brendel's soul force, causing the entire space to tremble. Thunder rumbled, and a ring of electricity swept out in all directions. With a crackling sound, the young man who was facing off against Cabius suddenly felt something strange. He lowered his head and saw the hairs on his coat standing up. When he looked up again, he saw arcs of electricity appearing and disappearing on his black coat, the streets, and even the buildings and ruins on both sides of the street. Blue and white sparks extended along all the electrical conductors, creating a crackling sound. Brando was startled, and he instinctively felt that something was wrong. He looked back, but the mist in front of him was still calm. However, the strange silence made him feel a sense of vigilance. He walked forward, and as he moved, Cabius moved as well. A huge skeleton emerged from the ruins and blocked his path. Brando looked up and glanced at the skeleton. What's wrong? Haven't you learned your lesson yet? Cabius cracked open its jaws and laughed. Why don't you try? The young man's face darkened, and with a clang, he unsheathed his sword. It was Scarlet's sword, but it felt lighter in his hand. Even so, the action of unsheathing his sword forced Cabius to take a step back. It could be seen that this undead lord was very wary of his strange element, but he was still determined to keep him here. Brando frowned. Cabius's cunning was far beyond his expectations. Without knowing what was happening in front of him, he did not dare to attack recklessly. He did have a white deer statue that he could use for reconnaissance, but Necromancer Rothko was much more proficient in magic than he was. He was afraid that he wouldn't be able to win if he played such tricks in front of Rothko. Why hasn't Medusa reported the situation? Brando cast his senses forward, but there was no response. It was as if he was looking into the mist. He took a deep breath, and at that moment, a familiar, weak voice sounded in his mind. My lord, time is limited, so I'll keep it short. There is also an undead general who is very strong. Cough cough. His name is Bai. This was Medusa's voice. But his voice stopped abruptly. What? This name made Brando's mind explode. Why was this guy here? When he thought of the cold metal mask behind that name, the hair on his back stood on end. If he guessed correctly, there was only one person in Insursta's camp who would be addressed in such a manner, and that was one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse, the Black Knight, the Judge Ba. Tiamas. Chiyoyu. But this guy was Tarkus' deputy. Shouldn't Tarkus and Madara still be fighting Erwin's southern army further south? What was going on? If it was just an alliance with Grodin or Count Randner, there would be no need for such an important figure to appear. What are these damned undead plotting? Countless thoughts flashed through Brando's mind. Bah. Ai's appearance had caught him off guard, but he was still able to maintain his composure on the surface. He raised his head and glared coldly at Cabius, then walked closer with his sword in hand. The yellow soul fire in the skeleton's eye sockets flickered. It did not understand why Brando suddenly became so impulsive. However, it only had one mission, and that was to stop this young man. Cabius's body was slightly hunched, but it had already gripped the short spear in its claws tightly. Brando gritted his teeth in the face of this troublesome fellow. Now that the situation had changed, he did not have the time to tangle with this fellow. He spoke coldly, "Cabias, if you still want to return to the Hill of the Dead to manage your own territory, I'll give you one last chance." In a moment of desperation, Brando did not hesitate to call out Cabias's background. Cabias's eyes flickered. "Are you familiar with us?" Brando acted as if he did not hear it and casually threw his sword to the ground. Clang. The young man raised his head and stared at Cabias without saying a word. It was as if he was looking at an inanimate object. Cabias cracked open its jaws and sneered, "What, young human, are you thinking of surrendering?" "Cabias, you fool, be careful." Rothko's voice came from the side of the street. "What?" "Be careful, he's emitting magical waves," the young necromancer reminded. Cabias was stunned and could not help but stare at Brando, who was motionless. However, while it was on guard against the sudden attack, it stretched out its bony finger and pointed forward. "You're saying that not only is this young man in his early 20s a gold-rank swordsman, he's also a sorcerer? Rothko, have you become an idiot from studying necromancy?" the tall skeleton asked in a mocking tone. Rothko's voice fell silent. In fact, even he himself felt that it was impossible. Because even the chosen one could never be perfect in every aspect. Some people might be talented, but their time was always limited. A gold-ranked swordsman in his early 20s with the status of a necromancer was simply a fantasy. Perhaps only the sages from the War of the Holy Saints could have such strength. But what kind of existence were the sages? Flame King Gretel, Wind Empress Saint Tassel, High Priest Fanzan, and Saint Eloranta. These were the 4 sages who led the various races to defeat the Dark Dragon in the War of the Holy Saints. Which one of them was not a true ruler? Even the eternal King Loki, who held the Mercury staff and ruled Madara, could only bow his head in front of these sages. Whether it was in terms of strength or reputation, Loki could not compare to them. What Rothko and Cabias did not know was that the magical waves emitted by Brando did not come from a necromancer. It came from a planeswalker. Brando lowered his eyelids and silently searched his elemental pool. In fact, since the first time he opened his elemental pool basically did not change. 10 slots for the fire element, 8 for the other elements, and still no light or darkness element. Looking at this half-crippled elemental pool, the youth could not help but sigh inwardly. With such meager strength, there was no way he could change the situation. Brando closed his eyes and let out a long sigh. In that case, there was only one way left. At the same time, when Cabias saw Brando standing there motionlessly with his eyes closed, it did not take the initiative to attack. Instead, it took a small step back. In the previous battle between the youth and it, the strange elemental energy had left a deep psychological shadow on the tall skeleton. Although the undead did not have emotions like fear, they did not have the habit of taking the initiative to teach their opponent a lesson. Especially for a high-ranking undead lord like Cabias. First of all, the honor of the Dark Nobles did not allow it to do so. "Mana is gathering, Cabias." Rothko could not help but speak up. The mana surrounding Brando had already broken through the limit of an intermediate wizard and was heading straight for a high rank. It was about to break through the boundary between iron and silver. Cabias made a cracking sound from its chest and replied in a bad mood, "I know, I can feel it too. Don't worry." Indeed, a silver-ranked wizard was nothing to worry about. However, a gold-ranked swordsman and a silver-ranked wizard at the same time. Such a scene caused the undead duo to be at a loss for words for a moment. Rothko even suspected that it was a mistake for them to come here and cause trouble for this youth. His potential was limitless. He could not believe that he was able to witness the birth of such a genius with his own eyes. However, Brando finally opened his eyes. His light brown pupils were calm, and at that moment Rothko and Cabias could feel that the youth's aura had changed. It was no longer the cold aura of an elemental essence, but a state that encompassed all things. 4 o'clock. The people of Matatanya call it the dark slumber. It is the time when all things are resting. Brando raised his eyelids and looked at the tall skeleton general. If I remember correctly, the undead call it the midnight day. It is the time of the day when the power of darkness is at its strongest. Did I say anything wrong, Cabias? Cabias gripped the short spear in its hand tightly and made a meaningless sound from its chest. "It's nothing," Brando shook his head. "I just want to say that before the sun rises, the world is indeed dark." He raised his hand and threw a card forward. Although it was empty in the eyes of Cabias and the others, it was as if Brando had really thrown out a card that shone with the light of fate. "However, the darkness is also beneficial to me. The card fell to the ground. Card of Fate. Mercenaries of Lopez discarded back into the deck and reset into the field. The wind elemental pool was emptied in an instant. Then, under the shocked gazes of Cabias and Rothko, 12 mercenaries appeared along with 12 magic circles on the street. The mercenaries of Lopez who had just entered the field looked at each other, not understanding what was going on. However, the Nightsong Tiger was the first to react. He immediately asked in his mind, "My lord, what happened? Did you reset your deck?" Brando nodded. But Cabias's gaze swept across the mercenaries one by one, the soul fire in its eyes flickering slightly. "I didn't expect you to be a summoner, young human. With the strength of a silver-ranked, you can summon 12 iron-ranked creatures at once. I have never seen such a summoning spell before. You are not an ordinary person, Brando or Viscount Gaston." But the tall skeleton changed the topic and asked in a hoarse, deep voice, "Do you really think that you can change the tide of the battle just because you have 12 more iron-ranked combatants?" Cabias shook its head and sneered. But the young man did not seem to hear its words. He already had a plan in mind. He turned around and looked at the Wild Elf sisters. P.S. Students, please support more vigorously. This is a rare opportunity to get a promotion equals. Smiley face. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 231. In the laws of all things, from 2 to 6 o'clock in the day, the people of Mauritania called it the dark slumber. It symbolized the slumber of the land and the world. However, the planeswalkers called it the rest phase. It was the last phase of the day for the planeswalkers. During this phase, the planeswalkers shuffled their cards back into their deck, calculated their mana and rearranged their battle tactics. The planeswalkers' rules, Falerne. Brando's gaze fell on the Wild Elf sisters. "My lord, is there something you need?" Falerne was slightly startled. She then looked at her lord with vigilance. Her emerald green eyes carried a lukewarm and distrustful expression as she replied, "Let your elemental pool resonate." "What?" "Activate elemental resonance." Brando repeated with a serious expression. "My lord, you," the Wild Elf sisters and Rothko, who was hiding in the shadows, were all startled. In fact, activating elemental resonance was not a big deal. On the contrary, every elven teacher would deliberately let their elemental pools resonate with the next generation of elementalists, so that their students could experience the so-called harmony between the elements. This was the only way to deepen the affinity between the new elementalists and the 6 elements. But other than that, elemental resonance was useless. Then what was he trying to do? Falerne, Tia and Rothko were all stunned. The only possibility they could think of was that Brando wanted to become an elementalist on the spot. However, this was undoubtedly a fantasy. Becoming an elementalist was not as simple as gaining the approval of the 6 major elements. In fact, being an elementalist was the same as being a wizard. It was a systematic and complicated subject. Without a long time of study, a layman would not be able to take shortcuts to become an elementalist. Thinking of this, the elder Wild Elf sister could not help but look at Brando with a troubled expression. The younger Wild Elf sister was even more direct, and she asked in a crisp voice, "My lord, your idea is a little unrealistic." Tia, the elder Wild Elf sister, ground her teeth. But Brando did not have the time to explain to them. He looked at Cabias, who was standing not far away, and calmly replied, "Listen to me, Falerne." Falerne nodded with a troubled expression. She closed her eyes and silently let her elemental pool boil. Although elemental resonance did not affect the user, it would cause the stored elemental pool to evaporate into thin air, especially on the battlefield. But since it was her lord's order, she had no other choice. But at the same time, a line of green text appeared in front of Brendel's eyes. "Detected instructor system, would you like to take on a part-time role? Please wait." He opened up his EXP system and said, "That's right. XP, 64420, Commoner level 1, Militia level 6, 0/200, Mercenary level 26, 47555537. The 54989 EXP that he had saved from the perfect storyline reward had now been reduced to 64,420 EXP after a day of continuous battles. But when the young man saw the number, he hesitated. He was well aware that if he thought about it, it would mess up his original plan. At the very least, the EXP he had accumulated for the second talent mission would vanish into thin air, and there was no telling how long it would take him to gather it again. After all, the reward of a perfect storyline was something that could only be chanced upon and not sought. However, he had no other choice. He had already made this decision before he came here. Brando opened the experience lock system. The green text changed in front of his eyes. Please distribute your experience. Level up Scholar to 15. Scholar level increased to level 15. The first free part-time position has been opened. A part-time elementalist. Do you want to use the free part-time job option? Yes. The moment Brendel nodded, the elder of the Wild Elf sisters, Falerne, opened her eyes. Her wide emerald eyes were like beautiful emeralds, and she looked at Brando in disbelief. The younger sister, Dia, covered her mouth in an exaggerated manner, looking at Brando as if he was a monster. On the other side, the young necromancer who was hiding in the shadows coughed loudly, and he almost slipped and fell out of the alley. What's wrong? Rothko, you bastard. What's going on? Cabius finally realized that something was wrong, and it couldn't help but roar. But it wasn't a necromancer, nor was it an elementalist. It couldn't feel the restlessness of the 6 elements that permeated the night air. It was as if they were lingering, filled with a sense of uneasiness and joy. They lingered around Brando's body, cheering for the birth of a new elementalist in the land of Wond. An elementalist, an enforcer of the laws of the elements. The most unbreakable ally of the 4 elven kings. Just like what Brendel saw at this moment, rows of ghostly green words began to change in his vision. Elemental contract established. Elemental resonance frequency adjusted. Spellcaster's hidden attribute bloodline revealed. Part-time job successful. When the text faded away, Brando seemed to have been pulled back to reality. All that was left in his vision were the Wild Elven sisters. Pharaoh opened her mouth and she looked at Brando with a complicated expression as if she was struggling to speak. Congratulations, my lord. Welcome to the world of elementalists. This is unbelievable, my lord. Dia looked at Brando with sparkling eyes, as if she had discovered a new continent. There was curiosity and blind worship in her eyes. Wait. The Night Song Tiger interrupted them. You're saying? He turned around and looked at Brendel with a strange expression. But Pharaoh only nodded. There was complete silence. That's impossible. Cabius could no longer hold back and shouted, breaking the silence. It even took a step forward and stomped on a stone floor. Rothko, do you know what kind of joke you're making? No one can become an elementalist just by sensing the elemental resonance, unless the elemental Emperor Tumen is reborn. But my lord, I'm not joking. This is just... Rothko slapped his forehead helplessly. If he did not see it with his own eyes, he would not have believed it. At this point, they suddenly stopped and looked at the young man without saying a word. The tall skeleton lord was stunned for a long time before it managed to squeeze out a retort. Perhaps this is unbelievable, but young human, what's the point of doing this? Could it be that you think I'll be frightened by this and make way for you? What can a newly promoted elementalist do? Although it said so, there was a trace of uncertainty in its tone. Because who knew if this damned young man would come up with something else? But Brando only glanced at it. He lowered his eyelids and silently checked his stats. After becoming an elementalist, his elemental pool had increased by 2 slots, and his fire elemental pool had increased by 3 slots. His light and dark elemental pools had also been opened, each with 2 slots. This was not out of Brando's expectations. It was much lower compared to the players. But it did not matter, this was just the first step. Because for this night, the show had just begun. Brando opened up his experience lock for the second time. He paused for a moment and immediately pointed to the Elementalist class he had just obtained. Elementalist Level 1 Experience Requirement, 6. Agree. Elementalist Level 2 Experience Requirement, 10. Agree. Elementalist Level 10 Experience Requirement, 610. Pharaoh's face suddenly changed. How? How is this possible? She looked at Brando blankly and almost blurted out. But if she was in disbelief before, this wild elf young lady suspected that she was dreaming at this moment. Brando's rapidly increasing elemental density was like a myth, weaving a strange dream. She never thought that an elementalist could increase his strength so quickly. No, this was not just a matter of fast speed. This was simply like sitting on a rocket. Unless it was God's chosen, it was impossible for anyone to reach the heavens in a single step. But God had long since disappeared from the earth. Martha above, the girl could not help but groan in her heart. What was going on? But Brando did not seem to care about the feelings of the people around him, because his level was increasing step by step. Elementalist Level 17, Experience Requirement, 4620. Elementalist Level 18, Experience Requirement, 6333. Elementalist Level 22, Experience Requirement, 12870. When he reached level 22, Brando's thoughts finally stopped. He looked at the remaining 300 experience points in his pool and lightly sighed. It was a pity that the main attributes of an elementalist were willpower, bloodline, and wisdom. Otherwise, at level 22, his character's level would have increased. His original attributes of strength, dexterity, and vitality might have directly broken through the elemental barrier and entered the elemental awakening stage. Of course, since he had chosen to take this step, he would not regret it. Moreover, it was not like he did not gain anything. He looked at his elemental pool. Fire elemental pool 37 slots, other elemental pools 32 slots, light and darkness elemental pools 24 slots. Brando raised his head and looked at Cabius. The peak of iron rank. The tall undead lord gritted his teeth as he spoke. That's it? That's it? Cabius finally let out a sigh. Cabius let out a long sigh. It was almost worried that this young man would break through his elemental barrier right in front of it. Although it seemed impossible, when something even more impossible had happened, there was nothing impossible in this world. Moreover, in Cabius's eyes, this youth in front of it was undoubtedly an existence that could make the impossible possible. But fortunately, this world was still a reality. The undead lord could not help but shed tears of gratitude. But Brando looked at it and said, "Do you still remember what I said before?" "What?" "I said that if you still want to return to the Hill of the Dead to manage your territory, I'll give you one last chance." Cabius was stunned. It subconsciously turned around and saw Rothko running away. "Rothko, you bastard, what are you doing?" Cabius could not help but roar. But when it turned around again, it saw that the human who had been confronting it all this time had put his hand into his bosom and took out a book. It was a book with a black cover. "But it's a pity that you won't have the chance," Brando said. "Cabius? P.S. Third update." Chapter 232. Brando flipped open the book. Page 17, line 2. His slender fingers stopped there. "Unlocking this card requires 100 points of wealth." The book replied. A card appeared in his hand. Brando lowered his head and replied, "Unlock." Because he had given up on summoning Medisha, a third of the 318 points of wealth he had accumulated over the past month was gone. The young man raised the card and placed it in front of him. Starry sky reflection, mysterious and complicated. He pressed his index finger, thumb and middle finger on the card and showed it. Display card, Eternal Sphere. Eternal Sphere, Myriad Spectacles 9, 10 choose 10 mana, treasure, fantasy wondrous item, tap pay 5 choose. You choose the next card to enter the field and provide it with a perfect replica. The Eternal Sphere can only maintain a single illusion on the field. Starry sky reflection, mysterious and complicated. Brando paid 10 fire EP, but his mana was also depleted. The card floated in the air and turned into a mysterious light array. Then, a ball of mercury the size of a fist with 17 brass rings around it floated out of the array and stopped not far from Brando's left shoulder. Cabius was slightly taken aback when it saw this little toy, but the soul fire in its eye sockets immediately shrunk back. As an undead that was most sensitive to mana ripples and soul energy, it immediately sensed that something was amiss. This was a fantasy treasure, a gold-tier magic item. Cabius could not imagine how a silver-tier summoner and a peak iron-tier elementalist could summon a fantasy treasure. But it finally felt a sense of threat, and it could not let the opponent continue to prepare. For the first time, it felt that Brando's words were not empty. Even though it knew that it would be difficult to win against the opponent's strange elemental power, an inexplicable sense of urgency drove it to grip the short spear in its claws. Cabius let out a roar of unwillingness from its chest. It was already prepared to attack. As for that bastard Rothko, it could not be bothered with him anymore. But Brando also felt the same sense of urgency. He spent 5 fire EP to tap the Eternal Sphere. Then he drew the second card. This was the card of fate that he had always prepared in his 4 hands. He raised the card, put it down and said, "The light of mercy descends from heaven, and the emissary of God goes forth from the light." The young man's calm eyes reflected the approaching short spear in Cabius's hands, but Brando pointed forward. Along with the white light, white feathers fell from the sky. 4 pairs of wings protected Brando, one on the left and one on the right. Clang, clang. Cabius was slightly taken aback. It raised its head and for the first time, the soul fire in its eye sockets wavered. It was forcefully stopped. The tall skeleton general saw that the short spear in its hand was being blocked by 2 crisscrossed longswords on its left and right. The surface of the sword was bright as snow, and mysterious runes and patterns were engraved all over the blade. If a knowledgeable Buga sorcerer were here, he or she would have recognized these ancient runes as heavenly runes. This was a sacred language that came from behind the door of order, and only the proud light-blessed could master it. Cabias raised its head. In its eyes, two angels made of light flapped their 4 pairs of wings and floated around the young man. They arrogantly raised their chins and looked at it with a look of disdain. The long swords in their hands were crisscrossed, blocking its path forward. Brando stood behind the crisscrossed long swords with a black tome in his hand. He raised his head and looked at the skeleton general with a calm gaze. Upper silver tier. The skeleton general squeezed out the words one by one. Brando smiled at it. The flames in Cabias's eyes were about to burst out. It growled and took a step back. Upper silver tier was not enough to stop it. Even if it was caught off guard in front of a middle gold tier, a silver tier existence was nothing but cannon fodder. It used its gigantic skeletal claws to push against the ground and used the momentum to leap forward. The short spear in its hand drew a dazzling red line in the air. Brando took a step back and ordered the 2 angels to block it. With a loud bang, the 2 angels were sent flying. But that was enough. When the pristine archangel entered the battlefield, Brando had already retrieved the Wind Spirit Spider and Highland Squire from the graveyard. When the pristine archangel enters the battlefield, choose a non-black card from your graveyard and shuffle it into your deck. Cabias broke through the defenses of the 2 angels in an instant, but it had already raised a gray-white Highland Squire card and flicked it forward. Highland's Courage. In a flash of white light, the long-awaited young man rushed out of the magic circle with his hands on his head. By the name of Martha, my lord. The Shire rolled forward and screamed with a familiar voice, I can't believe you got me out so quickly. My lord, you are the wisest knight of the Highland, my lord. He let out a strange cry and ducked his head. An angel had already flown over his head and crashed into a pile of rubble not far away with a loud boom. Charles immediately glanced over and was so shocked that he clicked his tongue. Brando only smiled. His finger moved to the 9th page, the 3rd line. Card of Fate, Trial. To unlock this card you need to pay 80 wealth. Brando nodded and raised the card, Show me the trial. He put the card down. Trial. Wolf's Lair 2, Earth 10, Event Exploration. Target summoned creature received 250,000 EXP. The Wolf's Lair altar is a kind of spiritual harbor for the Lornians. Attached to? A voice replied in his mind when the card appeared. Brendel used 4 fingers to show the card to Seal, who was covering his head and scurrying away. Attach. The trial card disappeared in an instant, but another card appeared in front of Brando. Highland Mage, Knight 9, Water 5, Creature, Human Wizard, Level 45 Creature. When a Highland Mage enters the battlefield, 5 reputation per week. Maintenance cost, 2 Earth EP for every day this card remains in the battlefield. Highland's Courage. Brando was slightly stunned and looked up. He saw a white light descending from the sky. The Shire was standing in the middle of the light. His simple robe was bathed in the gentle white light, and 2 mysterious patterns appeared on it. There were also 3 circles of grayish-white patterns on the side of his robe. It was the symbol of a Highland Mage of the 7 rings. The person in question was stunned. He looked at himself in confusion and opened his hand. A short golden staff appeared in his hand. This is... The Shire was shocked. He looked back and saw the 2nd archangel flying towards him. The young man who had just become a mage immediately reached out his hand. It was as if a layer of transparent air cushion had appeared on his hand, and he gently held the archangel. The Shire raised his head and looked at Brando, his eyes full of surprise. The strength of a gold mage. Brando understood. His expression did not change and he immediately ordered, the Shire, Barrier of Stillness. The young mage naturally knew how to cooperate with his lord. He had already seen Cabias rushing towards them after breaking through the archangel. The Shire shook his head, thinking that these skeletons were too rash. He pointed his short staff in the direction of the archangel and said, Law of Time, Stillness and Imprisonment. A transparent wall appeared out of thin air. The Highland Mage pushed forward, and Cabias immediately crashed into the wall. The undead lord felt its movements slow down. It raised its head in surprise, and only then did it discover that there was another gold mage in front of it. A Highland Mage of the 7 rings. Cabias felt its soul fire on the verge of disintegrating. Oh Martha. Is this guy's reinforcements unlimited? How many gold mages does he have? The undead lord's jaw cracked open, and the soul fire in its eye sockets dimmed. For the first time, it felt the shadow of defeat looming over it. Unlike warriors, mages were weak in self-defense, but their spells were terrifyingly powerful. This was especially true for Highland mages, whose spells were strange and unavoidable. Once a warrior of the same rank or even a higher rank was entangled in a mage's spell, it was basically a guaranteed defeat. Moreover, this was the work of a great mage of the Seven Rings. It knew that its only chance was to end the battle before the Shire could cast a spell, but Brando, who was standing in front of him, had cut off the undead lord's last shred of hope. Brando held a large tome in his hand, looking at the tall undead lord with pity, and then shook his head. "Farewell, Cabius," he said softly. His expression deeply pierced Cabius's heart. It struggled unwillingly in the static barrier, roaring and roaring at a high frequency from its chest. However, in this transparent barrier, it could only feel heavy shackles binding its limbs. Its movements were as slow as a snail's. At the same time, Brando finally revealed his last summoning card. Wind Spirit Spiders. Brando was no longer the same as when he was in the auction house. With his abundant mana, he could summon an army of 50 spiders. When the densely packed sky-blue spiders landed on the street, everyone, including the Shire, was stunned. Everyone looked at the young lord, unable to understand why he would summon these little things that were not even at the level of steel. In the past, these spiders might have been able to win with their numbers, but in this place they were useless. Unless they were used for reconnaissance, but even if they were used for reconnaissance, the archangels were much faster than them. In the eyes of the Nightsong Tiger, the Shire, and the Wild Elf Sisters, Brando's actions were a waste of mana. However, their opinions could not change Brando's mind, and the young man continued to do as he pleased. He cut his hand, and the remaining 3 cards were Holy Sword, White Sunblade, and Golden Battle Flag. Brando took out the card of Fate, Holy Sword. He raised the card, paid the fee, and attached the card to the Wind Spirit Spider card. At that moment, everyone saw the image of a winged holy sword floating behind each of the Wind Spirit Spiders, as if they were holy swords floating in the air. There were 50 of them. As expected, Brando smiled. He raised his hand, and the Wind Spirit Spiders immediately formed a huge square formation behind him. It looked like a square formation formed by shining holy swords in the sky. Brando looked at the Shire. This? The young wizard was tongue-tied for a moment. That's why I gave this move a name. Brando turned around and looked at Cabius, who was still trapped in the barrier, and said, "Let's call it the Dragon Rider system." He raised his hand and waved his 5 fingers. Dragon Riders attack. Author's note: for chapters today, what time will it be tomorrow? If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 234. 50 golden flames were ignited in an instant. The dazzling beam of light swept across the spiritual armor around the undead lord's body like a stream of hot steel. A circle of ripples spread out, and the light spots splashed, cracked, or deviated like water splashes. However, the spiritual armor was also fading and collapsing. The temperature rose rapidly, deflecting the light rays. Cabius's face was distorted by the steam, and the spiritual armor finally crumbled. Madara? The undead lord's roar reverberated in the night sky, and the beams of light flashed 3 times in the darkness. "Oh, Martha, that idiot!" Roscoe stood in the alley, the soulfire in his eyes reflecting the beautiful golden lines under the night sky. He couldn't help but curse with his teeth clenched. Then he leaned weakly against the wall and slowly slid to the ground. He shook his head. He used to think that he was a genius. When Haku raised his head, his golden eyes squinted slightly. He threw away the corpse in his hand as if he was throwing away a toy. He could feel his spiritual barrier, absolute seal, shaking. There shouldn't be anyone stronger than me on the battlefield. The Black Knight was doubtful, and a deep light flashed in his eyes. However, at that moment, everyone on the battlefield felt a throbbing in their souls. This throbbing feeling swept across the entire battlefield in an instant. Even the soul fire of the skeleton soldiers, who had no emotions, was shaken. Everyone, including the undead, turned their heads subconsciously. Their eyes, or the soul fire burning in their empty eye sockets, were staring blankly in a certain direction. The battle stopped. Scarlet, who was covered in blood, got up from the ground. She used her fist to wipe away the blood dripping down from her chin. Her amber eyes still had a hint of stubbornness, but she could still feel the throbbing feeling clearly. It was as if she heard a crisp shattering sound in her heart. Crack. Something broke. She raised her head and saw that the spiritual barrier above her was crumbling, scattering, and falling to the ground. The huge fragments were like black shadows that melted into the air, emitting a piercing sound. The undead knight let out a low groan on the other side. Haku pressed his chest in shock. Someone had forcefully broken his enchantment barrier. This was impossible. The undead general, one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse, felt as if his soul fire had turned cold. There was no one on the battlefield who could surpass him in terms of power. However, a halo of light immediately reflected in his golden eyes. It was a cluster of light that appeared from the darkness and swept across the sky. Everyone was stunned. Their eyes followed the movement of the light. When the light passed over everyone's head, everyone subconsciously turned their heads in that instant. Thus they saw that in an instant the light spots in the air became incomparably dazzling. An holy aura was gathering. Dragon Knights, attack. The first beam of light appeared. It pierced through the darkness and descended from the sky. The mercenary closest to the beam of light turned his head and saw the beam of light piercing through the skull, chest, and pelvis of the 3 skeletons. At that moment, it was as if time had stopped. The young mercenary was at a loss. He opened his mouth slightly, but with a crash, the 3 skeletons had already fallen to the ground. Then came the second and the third. The light in the sky flickered one after another. The light became denser and denser as if it was raining. The rain of gods fell from the sky, and in the span of a breath, the skeletal spear throwers of the Bone-Thorn army were reduced to ashes. After 2 rounds of attacks, only a few skeletal spear throwers were left standing outside the defensive line. The mercenaries were stunned for a moment before they cheered. Martha Buff. Kill these filthy creatures. Cornelius stared blankly at the scene before him. He placed a hand in front of Sifrid to protect the little girl, and his heart was filled with joy. But even so, he could not help but wipe the cold sweat off his forehead. He looked at his second-in-command, who was also pale. The 2 of them had recognized the voice from the start. It was the voice of the young man. But they did not expect him to have such an ability. Cornelius finally understood what he had to do. He drew his sword and swung it forward. Brothers, attack. Don't waste this opportunity. With a roar, the tide of the battle changed. It was only at this moment that Ahab recovered from his shock. The undead knight's gaze landed outside the battlefield. But this time he only saw 2 holy angels splitting the fog apart and charging at him from the left and right. The angels flapped their wings with astonishing speed, and the holy swords were already right in front of his eyes. The undead knight did not move at all. He raised his scythe in his right hand and swept the 2 holy angels away, leaving behind white feathers that fluttered in the wind. But Ahab did not relax in the slightest. A large amount of mana was gathering in the air. He looked up and saw several edges of light appearing above his head. The edges of light formed a huge cube that was dozens of meters wide, and it quickly solidified into a large boulder that came crashing down on him. The ground trembled, and the boulder fell to the ground with a loud bang. Smoke and dust filled the battlefield. Substance transformation, law manifestation. A high circle law wizard. The undead knight crawled up from the ground, his face covered in dust, and stared at the fog behind him. When the fog parted, the battlefield was filled with cries of war. The mercenaries' attacks were like quicksilver, and without the support of the undead, Grodin's private army collapsed under the suppression of the dragoons. The undead general held his black scythe and coldly watched the cowardly humans escape from him one by one. It was as if a torrent of water was crashing down on the battlefield in his direction. At that moment, the battlefield was about to collapse. Loud, painful groans echoed in the air. But he still had one last chance. Ahab looked through the crowd and finally saw Brando standing on the other side of the battlefield. He had to get rid of the flying balls of light, but he did not have that much time. Ahab had reason to believe that someone was controlling these strange things and dominating the battlefield. But as long as he killed that young man, all his problems would be solved, and the scales of the battlefield would tilt in his favor. He snorted coldly and laid down the scythe in his hand. Brando also saw the Black Knight, one of the 4 knights of the apocalypse. This old opponent of his looked exactly the same as the Ahab he met in the past. He was still wearing the same pretentious outfit. But the Black Knight should not have obtained the evil dragon's blood yet, so it would be easier to deal with him. He smiled. To catch the bandits, first kill the ringleader. This was indeed a choice that the Black Knight, who had always been confident in his abilities and speed, would make. But Ahab did not expect his intentions to be seen through. He only saw the Shire standing behind the young noble with a short staff, followed by the Nightsong Tiger, the Wild Elf sisters, and the rest of the mercenaries of Lopez. After the two angels flew back, they landed on either side of Brendel as if they were his personal guards. But the Black Knight had never heard of anyone using the heavenly realm as guards. The strength of this group was quite strong, but he did not think that there was no chance. Then Ahab moved. His figure flashed, and the Black Knight flashed 3 times on the battlefield like a shadow. Each time he flashed, he crossed a distance of nearly 100 meters. But Brendel was not in a hurry. With a thought, the dragon cavalry in the sky suddenly changed their formation. They immediately turned their spearheads and aimed at a certain area, firing in unison. The chaotic golden light pillars hit the ground one after another, and it was as if a golden forest had suddenly appeared on the street. The dragon knights did not even need to aim. Their numbers were more than enough to make up for their lack of accuracy. Under the coverage of the light arrows, even a gold-ranked Black Knight would not dare to expose himself to 10 or even more silver-ranked attacks per second at any given moment. Left with no choice, he could only raise his scythe to counterattack. A black arc of light dispersed the rain of light and wiped out 7 or 8 wind spirit spiders in an instant. The Holy Sword card could provide silver-ranked attack power to the attached card, but it would not affect the other aspects of the card. In the face of a gold-ranked attack, the wind spirit spiders, which were not even at the level of steel, were as weak as paper. But when Ahab wanted to pursue further, he realized that the light dots in the sky had already scattered and were firing at him from afar. When he started moving again, they gathered together and suppressed him with powerful firepower. Apart from the advantage of the first attack, the Black Knight realized that he did not have any advantage at all. Instead, his speed inevitably decreased. Ahab raised his head. For the first time, he felt that his every move was under the enemy's control. On the other hand, the Nightsong Tiger and the others were dumbfounded by the Dragon Knight's nimble fighting style. The Shire explained to them with a profound expression. That's why I said that there are 3 indicators that will always exist in a game: skill, equipment, and stats. You can see that this is the embodiment of Sir Lord's superior skills and equipment. Of course, Sir Lord once told me, Charles, when you look at these 3 indicators, there will always be one that can help you. If one day you grow into an archmage, then you must thank me for telling you this secret. He nodded and said something that did not match his heart. Now that I've become a great wizard, you can see that I'm very grateful to my lord for telling me this secret. The wild elf sister could not help but giggle when she heard that. The Shire, Brando gritted his teeth, you better join the battle as soon as possible. Of course, my lord, I'm preparing a spell, the Shire immediately replied. But my lord, I saw a lot of nobles' private soldiers. Wait, what does that emblem have to do with Count Randner? That's Count Randner's men. Another count? Does that mean my lord has offended a noble again? The young wizard was shocked. By the name of Martha, my lord, I bet you must have been a person with a deep grudge in your past life. It doesn't matter. According to what you said, the 2 of us were hanged the last time. Brendel continued to give orders to the dragon cavalry system while he replied in annoyance, and this time, they'll just drag us out and hang us again. That's true. The Shire raised an eyebrow. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 235. The Shire's spell was finally completed. A wall of light formed by countless lines appeared in front of Brando. The Black Knight, who had just arrived, slashed the wall with his scythe, leaving a trail of sparks behind. His golden pupils contracted slightly, and he immediately retreated. In fact, when he saw the wall, he already knew that his mission was a failure. He could no longer kill the young man in a short time. Putting aside the fact that the wall of law created by a 7th Circle mentor was extremely sturdy, Brando himself was also a gold tier rank 1. At first, he thought that he could rely on his speed to win, but he did not expect that the other party seemed to have known what he would do from the start. The young human decisively gave up on supporting the entire battlefield and withdrew all the dragoons just to restrict his movements. Despite having so many bodyguards around him, he still chose to give up on the overall situation and focus on his own safety. Such a person was either too afraid of death, or he had a terrible sense of judgment. But no matter which one it was, at least he had won the gamble. Haku raised his head, the flames in his golden eyes burning. He calmly looked into Brando's light brown eyes not far away. He even had a feeling that his opponent was an old rival he had fought for many years. Of course, Haku did not know that Brando was the old rival he had fought for many years. The 2 of them had fought more than 10 times in the mountains of the Church's Knights nation, Grace. They knew each other very well. Moreover, at that time Haku had already obtained the evil dragon's blood. Whether it was maturity or strength, the Black Knight could not compare to him now. However, Brando's understanding of Haku and his own experience had not changed at all. But all of this was strange in the eyes of the Black Knight. He retreated, and Brando immediately ordered, "Stop him." Haku Tiamas Chiou, one of the 4 Knights of the Apocalypse, the Black Knight of the Scales of War and the Judge of War, was an undead general of Madara. Although his individual strength was always at the bottom of the 4 Knights, he was the most talented commander among the 4. Brando knew that he was the one who led the strategy to defeat Braggs in the Second War of the Black Rose, and it was not his style to let him return to Madara and become a thorn in the side of Erwin in the future. Besides, to him, killing Haku here was equivalent to cutting off one of Tarkus's arms. Furthermore, the undead army of Madara would not give him so much pressure in the south. Furthermore, he still had to face the wrath of Count Randner. Haku heard Brando's words and he could not help but sneer. "You want to kill him? It's not that easy." Even though he could not do anything to Brando at the moment, that was because he still had to maintain the noble's private army. If he did not have any worries and wanted to teach this young human a lesson, he believed that the outcome would be different. Even though Brando's words angered him, Haku still chose to retreat. As a general who excelled in intelligence, knowing what to do at the right time was an essential quality. He turned around and shook off the Shire's barrier of stillness, and flashed past the 2 holy angels like a ghost, and finally brushed past Scarlet, who had chased after him from the battlefield. The whole process happened in the blink of an eye, and the red-haired girl only had time to turn around to see the Black Knight's back was already dozens of meters away. "Bastard!" She gritted her teeth and looked in the direction of the Black Knight. Brando shook his head. In fact, he was also disappointed. He did not expect that he would fail. He wanted to use words to provoke this guy to stay, but he did not expect this guy to be as calm as he was after the first War of the Black Roses. He thought that Haku had always been arrogant, and he was not as mature as he was later, so he might be a little impulsive. How troublesome this freak! Brando could not help but curse. "Torrential Rain's design team, do you even know how to make an NPC? Can't you think from a player's point of view and make it simpler? Bastard." But he immediately thought of another problem and turned to the Shire. "The Shire, go find Cornelius. He might need your help, and I'm worried that Haku will take Groudon away." "Cornelius? A mercenary commander. He's one of us now." "What should I do, my lord? Are you a mage or am I a mage?" "Act according to the circumstances," Brando replied. "If that silly girl Freya can become the goddess of war, I believe you can do the same." "It's nothing," Brando replied with a straight face. "I'm just helping her plan her life." "Understood," the Shire bowed. "It's an honor." "Go." Brando nodded. The Shire could not help but sigh when he saw the red-haired girl limping towards him. "She really looks like Miss Freya, my lord. So this is your type." But before he could finish his sentence, Scarlet rolled her eyes. Scarlet gritted her teeth and glanced at the Shire before walking past him to Brando's side. "Scarlet?" Brando asked. "Yes." Scarlet was slightly surprised. Brando looked at her. "I'm fine." Scarlet wiped the blood off her face and replied casually, "But my lord Medisha, I know." Brando nodded. "But it doesn't matter. I still have enough light elemental energy to save Medisha." Scarlet glanced at the young lord. She vaguely knew the relationship between the Silver Fairy Princess and this young lord. Even though it was a little strange, she nodded and did not ask any more questions. She just needed to make sure that Medisha was fine. Even though Brando did not reply, she got the answer she wanted from his face. She knew that Brando was not the kind of person who would be indifferent to his subordinates' deployment. The situation on the battlefield was changing. In fact, the mercenaries had already crossed the last line of defense of the noble's private army. After Haku retreated, he immediately ordered the nobles to retreat into the inner city. But he did not expect that his order would cause the situation on the battlefield to become even more difficult to deal with. The Black Knight was used to commanding an undead army in battle. Even though he understood the habits of humans, he was not as good as the human generals when it came to understanding human nature. Without the support of the undead, Groudon's private army had no place to stand. Their morale was already shaken, and the nobles' private army completely lost their confidence when they heard the order to retreat. They scattered along the 5 streets like ducks being chased out of 1,000 miles. Brendel ordered the Nightsong Tiger to tell Cornelius not to kill them all before they entered the inner city. Otherwise, these arrogant and domineering nobles' private soldiers would probably be crying for their parents by now. Mr. Tiamas could only stare at the scene with his mouth agape. When the Black Knight got on his horse and saw the army scattering, he couldn't help but curse, "Fools!" But cursing was meaningless. Haku understood that. He looked up and saw the light spots that seemed to be cruising in the night sky. Occasionally they would shoot one or two beams to the ground, taking away the noble's private soldiers who were still stubbornly resisting, or the undead squads that had been scattered. The undead general's eyes flashed with interest. The young human had given him a bigger surprise than he had imagined. A summoner? Summoners didn't have such strange summoning spells, but he couldn't rule out the possibility that it was ancient magic. In the era before the Dark Dragon, the system of magic was very different from the one now. Just like the ancient string magic used by the dragons, it was a completely different concept from modern string magic. Haku's golden eyes narrowed slightly. If only Lord Tarkus' main force is here. Ghosts and high-ranked liches would be able to suppress these aerial units. But he knew that it was just wishful thinking. Lord Insursta had a more important mission in the south, and his main force was used to deal with Erwin's Southern Legion. It was impossible for him to appear here. He knew that the White Tower's Bonethorn army was already the limit, but he shook his head when he saw that the young human had caused him to lose close to 10% of his army's strength. Fortunately, it was just a skeleton javelin thrower. But even if he won, it wouldn't be that easy. There were still a few dozen guards in the inner city, most of them were knights that Grodin had usurped. He could rely on them to hold on for a while, but in this situation taking the Baron away was the safest option. It was hard to say if they could hold on until the main force arrived. He didn't want to take the risk. The Black Knight thought about this and silently looked towards the west. Young human, our battle is still ongoing. The Black Knight's nightmare warhorse passed by the scattered soldiers and entered the inner city at the fastest speed possible. He dragged his long cloak across the drawbridge like a bolt of black lightning, ordering the knight in the porch to raise the drawbridge and close the gate. He decisively gave up on the idea of reorganizing the burdens behind him. Not to mention whether the young human would give him the time to do so, Haku didn't plan to let them charge into the inner city to prevent him from taking advantage of the situation. As for whether the humans outside were dead or alive, it had nothing to do with him. When the undead general of Madara changed into a new set of armor and arrived at the top of the walls, he found that Brando and his mercenaries had already reached the inner city. They were faster than he expected. The scattered soldiers were fleeing along the walls of Abi's castle, unable to stop them at all. He turned around and saw Grodin standing beside him, wearing a long silk robe. His face was pale. Lord Tiamas? The Baron couldn't help but ask. We can't stop them here, the Black Knight looked down and replied coldly. If you want to stay alive, you have to come with me. The Baron was stunned. What about my men? He asked in a small voice. Can you control them? The golden eyes under the metal mask coldly glanced at him. Grodin was speechless. Just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard a cry of surprise. Both of them turned their heads at the same time, just in time to see a young man wearing a long robe with 3 golden patterns embroidered on his sleeves walk out from the mercenaries. He held a short staff in his hand and pointed forward. 6 golden rays immediately extended from the main street to the top of the inner city wall. Grodin was stunned. It's that archmage, stop him. Haku growled. But it was too late. The knight lowered his hand and said, Substance conversion law, equivalent exchange. Azu? The gem at the tip of the staff lit up. Ancient language, exchange? Meta. The 6 golden lines glowed faintly and extended downwards. Behind the lines, 3 gigantic bridges made of stone appeared out of thin air. There was complete silence. Allow me to rest for today. My gallbladder is about to burst from exhaustion. I have to cut it off as soon as possible. If you want to know what will happen after this, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 236. 6 dark and cold stone bridges rose from the Shire's staff and crashed into the inner city walls. The ground shook violently as Grodin's knights climbed up from behind the walls. They were terrified to find that there was no longer any obstacle between them and their enemies. The battlefield was silent for a moment. It was as if a silent angel had flown over everyone's head, rendering them speechless. However, the young magus withdrew his staff and stepped back. He then raised his head and smiled at the pale-faced knights on the city wall. At that moment, the dull sound of hooves could be heard from behind him. The mercenaries' cavalrymen rushed out from the Shire's back and overtook the young wizard in an instant. They rushed up the stone bridges. The cavalry moved forward, and the young lord's sword also moved forward. Brendel's sword reflected the cold light of the stars and remained motionless, as if it was responding to the same command. Attack. Destroy the enemy. The ground rumbled and the noble knight's expressions changed. A large number of mercenaries rushed up the walls, but Brando's summoned creatures were faster than them. The young man discarded his cards and summoned the two pristine archangels that were heavily injured in the battle with Cabias and Haku. He took out Medusa's card from the graveyard and ordered the pristine archangels to attack. The archangels of light flapped their wings and flew over everyone's heads. In an instant they reached the top of the city wall, and with a flash of their swords, heads fell to the ground. Although the strength of an upper silver tier was nothing in front of Cabias and Haku, it was like an insurmountable mountain to these noble knights. With Cabias as the center, the knights retreated one after another. Their only choice seemed to be to flee in panic, and a large number of them had no choice but to turn around and push each other down the tower. Soon a gap was created in the wall. Bai Lung coldly snorted when he saw this. He did not say a word and dragged Grodin into the castle. To him, the lives of these humans did not matter to him. He only wanted to make sure that Grodin was in good condition. Brando, who had been paying attention to the battle, saw the same scene. He smiled. Haku still doesn't understand the nature of humans. The young wizard lowered his head and whispered something to Scarlet. The young girl was slightly startled. She looked at him for a moment, then walked away doubtfully. Not long after she left, the battlefield was immediately filled with shouts. Lord Grodin has escaped. Lord Grodin has escaped. The few noble soldiers who were still resisting on the walls were startled when they heard the shouts. They could not help but turn around to look for Grodin, but the result was obvious. The front line was finally shaken. It was like the last straw that broke the camel's back. When Grodin's knights realized that they had lost their lord, they completely gave up after putting up some resistance. The situation gradually became clear. The mercenaries rushed into the castle like a flood and lowered the drawbridge. Brando then led his men into the castle. For him there was still one last battle. The interior of the castle was dark and obscure. The corridors seemed to be endless as they spiraled downwards. Perhaps Grodin thought that he was the only one who knew the location of the secret passage to AB's castle. Unfortunately, this was nothing to Brando. This was the innate advantage of his other soul. When the Baron and Madara's undead general entered the hall, the young wizard followed behind them. Both sides entered the hall at the same time. Both sides stopped when they saw each other. Brando, Scarlet, and the Shire were on one side, while Grodin and Haku were on the other. The Baron did not expect this to happen. At that moment, he was stunned and almost thought that he had been betrayed by someone. For a moment, both sides were separated by a long table and did not move. The hall was still the same hall. It was as if the scene from the day before had reappeared. Even the atmosphere was astonishingly similar. Under the eerie silence, the air in the hall seemed to have stopped moving. Brando raised his head and looked at the beautiful red crystal chandelier on the ceiling. He could not help but think that history was indeed similar. He had chosen to compromise here the day before, but now he wanted to take back what he had lost. He lowered his head and looked at Grodin and the undead knight in front of him. Haku was also looking at them quietly, seemingly unsurprised. The undead knight raised his right hand and blocked Grodin with his huge scythe. "Human, you are much more outstanding than I expected. I am surprised that Erwin has such a lowly noble like you." His voice was hollow like a layer of rusty metal that was losing its paint. Brando shook his head. "All right, let's not waste time, Tiamas," he interrupted. "You know whose life I'm here to take. I know I can't keep you here, but don't even think that you can take this Baron of Erwin away." He deliberately emphasized the last few words. A muffled sneer came from under the metal mask. "I don't know who you are, but I'll assume that you're the Viscount. But Viscount, I remember that the rules between nobles in the human world are not like this. The one behind me is the local lord, a noble baron. His family's bloodline can be traced back to the last dynasty in your world. But today, Lord Viscount, you're telling me that you're going to make a move on one of the members of this glorious family and set a precedent for a bloody massacre between nobles? Of course I can put down my hand," Haku shrugged. "But if I do you dare to kill him?" Grodin stood behind the undead general with a gloomy expression. "The honor of the kingdom will not fall on the head of a traitor. But a life-and-death struggle is not the rule of your game." Brando smiled. "If a mere Count Randner is enough to make me fight to the death, then why am I here?" Haku was slightly taken aback. "What a bold statement. I don't know where your confidence comes from, Viscount Gastine." Grodin finally had the chance to interject, gritting his teeth as he spoke. "A mere Count Randner. I don't know where your confidence comes from." Did I ask you to speak? Brando glared at him. The young man's cold gaze was like a knife that pierced into Grodin's heart. Grodin's pupils shrank and he immediately shut his mouth. The undead general of Madara clapped his hands. What courage! Grodin's metallic voice came from under the mask. But the Lornian said that a wise man should learn to find a balance between thinking and doing. Lord Viscount, I believe that Baron Grodin has learned his lesson, especially as a noble of the nobility. Why don't we stop here? There's still room for both of us to turn back. The Church's Night Kingdom is located between Grace and Saint Tassel. They are also the main ethnic group in Grace. The Lornians also said that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The Shire added with a smile behind Brando. But the blood that is shed is not your blood, my lord. Indeed, but nobles are not born with dignity. Brando coldly replied. Haku remained silent. But the young man also frowned because in his impression, this Black Knight of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse was never a person who talked nonsense. On the contrary, he and the White Knight, Ebden, were known to be taciturn and decisive in their actions. They preferred action over boasting. But now Haku's behavior was the exact opposite of what he knew. He did not think that it was because Haku's current personality had changed drastically since then. There was only one reason left. Was Grodin that important? He did not know what kind of agreement Madara had with the Randner family. What made him even more suspicious was Haku's intention to stall for time. However, the best way to break an unknown trap was to prevent them from getting what they wanted. Brando did not say a word. He stretched out his right hand and placed it on the hilt of his sword. With a light push, he took a step forward. As soon as he moved, a cold aura spread across half of the hall. Haku did not move, but Grodin, who was behind him, took 3 steps back and almost fell to the ground. The Baron finally managed to stand up with a red face. He gritted his teeth as he looked at Brendel, but his heart was filled with disbelief. Even though he was just an iron-rank swordsman, he could still feel the true strength that Brendel had displayed. He had grown stronger again. Grodin could not believe that a person could become so strong in a day and a night. Of course, he did not think that it was an illusion brought about by the fact that he was an elementalist. The only possibility he could think of was that Brendel was hiding his strength. He immediately whispered this to Haku. The Black Knight nodded and looked at Brando with a playful expression. It was impossible for Cabiaz's report to be wrong. However, Grodin would not lie to him. Moreover, he had experienced it himself. Who should I believe? However, the undead general of Madara remained calm and asked, Viscount, are you not going to think twice before acting? Tiamas, interfering in the affairs of humans is not beneficial to you. Brando shook his head. You know that you can't leave with Grodin. If that's the case, why do you want to fight a meaningless battle with me? Step aside, I know this is not your habit. Haku shook his head. He looked at Brando approaching and used his scythe to keep a distance from the Baron. This battle is not necessary for Viscount Grodin, but it's different for me. Even though Madara does not have the tradition of forming an alliance with the living, there's a first time for everything. If we abandon our allies the first time, it won't be good for our reputation. He smiled under his mask. Moreover, you're right about one thing. It will be difficult for me to protect the Baron when he's surrounded by powerful enemies. Mr. Iamus. Grodin was startled, his face turning pale as he hurriedly asked. P.S. Thank you for your support. Even though the highest order of subscriptions didn't change much, the average order of subscriptions increased a lot. Thank you. Chapter 237. Mr. Tiamas. Grodin was startled by Haku's words and his face turned pale. The only person he could rely on right now was the undead general of Madara. If Haku couldn't protect him, the young Viscount would definitely kill him. But Haku ignored him and continued, But I'm confident that I can hold on for half an hour. Half an hour? Brando caught the gist of Haku's words like an old rival. What's the point of half an hour? Or do you have a purpose for stalling me for half an hour? If you weren't an enemy, I would have suspected that you were one of my best friends when I was alive. Haku sighed. Why do you always act like you know me so well, even if it's Marissa? No one knows me so well. Brando only smiled. He knew that Marissa was Haku's personal maid, and he knew that Haku was insulting him by saying that. But he was not willing to show any signs of weakness even if he lost. This was in line with his understanding of this person. Even if he lost, he would not admit defeat. Even in Madara, he had offended many people, or else he would not have been sent to Insursta's army, which was a ragtag army. But he didn't hold back at all. He continued forward until he was less than 10 meters away from Haku. At the same time, the Shire also prepared a spell behind him. Mr. Viscount, Haku said. Have you ever wondered why the West Gate didn't give you a signal? Brando was startled. He thought of something and his face darkened. Ah, I remember that it's a beautiful red-haired mercenary, right? The undead knight replied, Of course you don't have to worry, my lord. I don't have enough men to cause any trouble for them. But there's one thing I have to tell you. The men I sent to stop them should be more than enough to buy them some time. Brando didn't say a word. However, Bai continued, I think at this time Shiman and my kind should have already broken into the city. Of course they are all filthy low-level skeletons that lack command. You know that I don't really trust those low-level liches. But Mr. Viscount, no matter what, if you don't go back and remedy the situation immediately, not to mention the life of that beautiful lady, I'm afraid the entire battle situation will become very troublesome, right? The young man had finally finished listening to his nonsense. He took a deep breath and tried his best to restrain himself from punching him in the face. Right now, he only wanted this crow's mouth to be unable to speak anymore. However, although he was angry, his heart was very clear that the other party had no reason to lie. As a matter of fact, he had been worried about the battle at the West Gate. Just like what Bai said, he had not received the magic beacon from the female mercenary group leader named Yuta. However, if the situation was really as serious as the latter said, the situation would not be as simple as just troublesome. It would be extremely dangerous. Not to mention the losses these undead caused to ABs, they also sealed off their escape route. The walls of the inner city were low and could not withstand the impact of the skeleton army. And if they let the enemy take advantage of the situation and attack the inner city, Brando could not help but feel his heart sink. He did not think that Brendel would dare to divide his forces at this time. He could not help but wonder if Brendel really cared about Groton's life. Even if he said that he did not care, his actions did not seem like it. But if he said that he cared, this plan was more like a madman's. Unless he wanted to take Groton away from the start. But was there a need for that? Groton was only one of Count Randner's sons, and he was not even the eldest son. Brando could not help but take a deep breath. Tiama's attack had hit his vitals. He raised his head and looked at the Black Knight with a gloomy expression. He finally understood the knight's intention to stall for time. Fortunately, he was alert enough and did not let the knight's scheme succeed. At least he still had a choice. Damn it, as expected of the scales of war, Brando cursed in his heart. This was the first war of the Black Rose. But this guy had already displayed wisdom and foresight that was not inferior to the future. Brendel even had a feeling that this guy might have already guessed what he was planning to do. Brando tightened his grip on his sword hilt. If he could, he really wanted to kill Brendel. Compared to killing Groton, Brendel was more willing to kill Groton first, but he knew it was unrealistic. Brendel smiled at him. There's still half an hour left. Let's make a deal. Groton, who was behind him, also let out a sigh of relief. The Baron squeezed out an ugly smile from his stiff face. He looked at Brando, who seemed to be stuck in a dilemma, and his heart was filled with a sense of schadenfreude. It was as if the city of Abes, which was about to be destroyed, was not even part of his territory and had nothing to do with him. But that's true. I can just rebuild the city if it's destroyed. As for the people, they're all over the place and I don't care about them. He was more concerned about Brando's feelings. He couldn't help but smile. Young man, there's a price to pay for being impulsive. But he suddenly remembered the price he had to pay for provoking Brendel, and his tone softened. But I admit that you're strong. Strength is always worthy of respect. Of course, if you're willing to put this matter to rest, I can also make a promise on behalf of my father. I promise that the conflict between us will end here. He seemed to relax as he spoke with assurance. You should know that nobles aren't willing to go to war where both sides suffer. But there's one more thing. My adopted daughter is still in your hands. He was about to continue the topic when he saw Brendel turn around and stare coldly at him from under the metal mask. Groton felt a chill in his heart. He suddenly realized something and quickly shut his mouth. At the same time, Brendel turned around and waited for Brando's reply. The Shire and Scarlet also looked at their lord. Brando replied coldly, compromising again and again. Tiamas, do you think I'm a complete idiot? Or are you willing to give up? I know these skeletons can't stop you, my lord, but what about your subordinates? The undead knight asked. Of course I can accept it. This is the difference between you and me. Groton smiled gloomily. He knew that Brendel was trying to force Brando to give him a hard time. But he liked the idea, especially the day before when he used the same method to force Brando to compromise. Seeing his opponent walk into the same trap twice filled him with a gloomy sense of mischief. Brando sighed. Tiamas, there's an old saying in my hometown. He loosened his grip on the hilt of his sword. A man can't step into the same river twice in his life. Brendel nodded. Brando's right hand flashed, and the long sword in his hand drew a straight line towards Grodin. The undead knight reacted in a split second. He raised the giant scythe in his hand slightly, and with a clang, the long sword flew past the Baron's right arm with a flash of silver light. With a thud, it nailed itself into an oil painting not far behind. But even though it was fixed, the sword's hilt was still trembling. Brendel looked behind him. Grodin was already clutching the wound on his right arm. His face was pale and he looked at Brando with hatred in his eyes. This was the second time. He didn't know what kind of deep hatred this young man had for him to teach him a lesson every time. Brendel turned around and sighed. Why do you have to do this, Mr. Brando? Hatred is not unresolvable. But what I'm more interested in is what you meant by that sentence you said earlier. That sentence can be interpreted in many ways, Brando replied calmly, but I like one of them the most. It's that a man can't make the same mistake over and over again in his life. It's a test of a man's intelligence. So, Brendel looked at him, you want to fight me? That's right. The undead knight's grip tightened, and his metal gauntlets tightened around his scythe. He stared at Brendel and said, then give it a try. I'm looking forward to seeing if you can get around me in a shorter amount of time. The spiritual armor formed by the soul fire expanded in an instant, forming a silver wall that was close to solidifying. Brando looked at him and shook his head. Tiamas, what did you get wrong? What do you mean? Brendel asked. In fact, I've already avoided you, Brendel said calmly. His gaze swept past the knight's shoulder and landed on the long sword that was stuck in the painting. The sword was still trembling, and its tip was pinned to a card that no one else could see. It was a card depicting a unicorn knight. The elven flag flutters high, the heart shines, the sword shines. Come out, Medisha. A mournful scream rang out. Brendel turned around and saw a silver knight's spear piercing through Grodin's chest. The Baron's face was still filled with disbelief. He used all his strength to turn around, but the spear only retracted slightly, and a stream of blood shot out. Grodin fell to the ground like a pile of rotten meat. The undead knight turned around and glared at Brendel. Medisha, how is this possible? Didn't I already injure her? He growled. Brando looked at him with a condescending and mocking gaze. Do you still remember that I'm a summoner? The Shire couldn't help but shiver when he heard Brendel's words. What kind of summoner is this? Brendel frowned. That's impossible. Summoners can't bypass my soulfire wall and summon at a fixed point. Brando smiled. That's why I'm the special one. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 238. The slender sword pierced through the skull, and the last undead terracotta also lost its strength and fell to the ground. The female mercenary with long red hair held her sword with one hand and panted heavily as she looked around. Her emerald eyes reflected the corpses and skeletons on the ground. The battle was over. Although they paid a heavy price, they managed to repel the attackers. Janna heaved a sigh of relief and sheathed her rapier in a black leather sheath. Leader! A shout came from behind. She turned around and saw a young man running out of the crowd. The female mercenary saw the young man running in front of her, but she stopped him and said, No need to say anything, leave some people behind to take care of our injured brothers. The rest of you come with me. We've wasted enough time, we need to take control of the west gate before the undead army arrives. Wait. The young man called out to him breathlessly. What's wrong? Yuta frowned. It's too late, the young man said loudly. When we were fighting with the monsters, Rat, and the others saw the magic beacon from the south. Leader, it's too late, the undead have already arrived. If we go there now, we'll only face the undead army. The female mercenary leader stopped and looked at him. What else did Rat say? Rat said that our only choice is to give up. We'll break through the encirclement to the north and leave Abes. If the undead come, we'll all die here. If we leave, what about the others? Leader, can we change anything by staying here? The young man said anxiously. Bastard. The female mercenary leader punched the wall. Tell our people to prepare. Tell the owls, gray wolves, and brown bears to lead people along the 3 streets. Since we can't stop them from entering Abes, we'll stop them from entering the city. Leader, you're crazy. The man shouted. We have less than 300 people and there are thousands of them. We can't stop them without the city walls. The female mercenary leader pressed her chest and gritted her teeth. We have to stop them even if we can't. Do you want me to break my promise? Leader. The young man was startled. What are you waiting for? But is it worth it for a noble? The youth took a deep breath. That young man is also a noble. He only helped us because of the conflict between him and Groton. In the end, they were still the same kind of people. Why should we fight for people like them? The man gritted his teeth and shouted at her, Leader, your sister and parents died in the hands of those damned nobles. Most of the brothers under your command also had the same experience. Everyone respected you, so we came together. Why should we die here for that kind of person? Let them fight amongst themselves. Yuta was stunned. She sighed and raised her head to say something. However, at this moment, a loud bang came from the direction of AB's castle. Everyone turned around and saw a beam of white light rising into the sky from the darkness. It was a magic beacon. A pure white beam of light pierced through the night sky, as if it had pierced through the darkness of the world. The light seemed so pure and flawless against the deep background, as if it was the first tear of Mother Marcia in the darkness in the epic of the creation of the Kurlutz people. It was the first light that depicted the birth of the world. Light was born from the darkness, giving all things wisdom, nobility, and spirituality. At that moment, Yuta and her assistant raised their heads in a daze, their eyes reflecting the light in the darkness. They watched as the light rose to the highest point and exploded. Then it turned into a message that was commonly used in the army. The words shone in the night sky and did not fade away for a long time. The red-haired female mercenary captain raised her head, and a deep glint flashed in her dark green eyes. Groton is dead. My lord wants us to reply immediately, she said calmly. My lord? The youth looked at her in shock. Yuta lowered her head and smiled at the youth. If Cornelius dared to choose this path, why wouldn't I? Groton is dead, and that young noble gave me an answer. From now on he will be my follower. She smiled and shook her head. Unfortunately, the time is too short. But, no buts. Can we reply? Yuta asked. The youth shook his head. Those liches used dark magic to silence the entire street. Other than the light and dark elements, no other elements can enter. But we don't have any wizards or priests in our group. Our strongest elementalist is only an iron-ranked warrior, and we can't cast any spells. What about the signal arrow? Rat said that the arrow is ignited by elements. Yuta gritted her teeth and looked at the other side of the street. Then we'll use our own method to buy some time for our lord. Leader? But the woman's face had already turned serious. She was silent for a moment, raised her head, turned around, pulled out her thin sword and waved it to the right. Everyone has one. Listen up. Someone gave us an answer with noble actions, but now we've lost our promise. Fortunately, we can still salvage the situation. So I order you to move forward and drag those damn skeletons here. Or let them step over our corpses. The street was silent for a moment, and only Yuta's solemn order echoed for a long time. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked at the regiment commander subconsciously. Answer me, there are no cowards among my men. There are no cowards. The mercenaries raised their weapons. The young man stared blankly at Jana. He wanted to say something but was interrupted by the female mercenary commander. You don't have to say anything. You know that I won't change my mind easily once I give an order. But leader, why do you have to do this for a noble? Yuta smiled gently. She lowered her head and patted the youth's face. I know nobles better than you, little one. If that young man was a noble, he wouldn't have killed Groton. This is the rule between them, and no one has ever broken it in the past few hundred years. She raised her head and looked at the dark night. But no matter who he is, at least from this moment onwards, our deal is done. The youth was stunned for a moment. At the south gate, the fierce battle was still ongoing. Under the supervision of the Firebrand Legion's Grand Commander, the mercenaries maintained the same rhythm time and time again, engaging in a tug-of-war with the skeletal army without any regard for their own losses. The battle in the darkness seemed to be endless. Everyone could not help but feel exhausted. As far as the eye could see, all they could see were piles of white bones. The humans and the undead exchanged losses, and the corpses piled up like mountains. However, the most they could do was to maintain the battle line above the ruins. Fortunately, the breach in the city wall was only 10 meters wide, and most of the iron-ranked mercenaries were barely able to stop the undead army that outnumbered them by 100 to 1. In fact, the mercenaries understood this, and they were willing to pay 10 times the amount of blood to repair the breach in the city wall. It was no longer a battle, but a mincemeat that lacked the beauty of battle tactics. The commanders of both sides were like grim reapers. silently adding more lives to the short 10 meters of flesh and blood battlefield. But to Madara's side, the liches could emotionlessly push the skeletons to the center of the table as if they were worthless chips. And this was the most chilling thing for the humans. Crossbowmen in position, reload the blunt arrows. The leaders of the mercenaries acted as heralds at this time. They watched as the experienced warriors unscrewed the corks of the bottles of holy water and poured it on the bundles of arrows. They could not help but feel a little sad. In normal battles they rarely used these consumables so extravagantly. The warriors raised their four-armed crossbows, aimed and fired. Then there was a shrill sound as if an invisible wall had swept through the rows of skeletons below. The skeletons fell without warning and immediately turned into ashes in the white light. Rabin stepped on a pile of skeletons with one foot and carried his sword on his shoulder with one hand. He had just indifferently replaced the exhausted first team with his second team. Then he ordered a small mercenary group to carry the wounded down from the city wall. To him this battle seemed endless, just like the battles he had experienced in Karsuk. Rabin calmly commanded. He knew how far Madara and himself could go. But at this time he also turned his head and looked up at the flash in the dark sky. His eyes reflected the beam of light and he smiled. Nobles killing nobles, it's worth the ticket price. But it's the first time I've seen them use methods other than conspiracy, poison, and assassination. That young man is really barbaric. Those nobles are capable of anything, his deputy replied. Rabin glanced at him. You don't understand, he said. Then he asked, how long more? Half an hour, the deputy replied immediately. Rabin waved his hand. Go put our battle flag higher. After repelling this attack they will replace the lich. That guy gave me an answer and now I have to give him an answer. Dawn. The leader of the Firebrand Legion looked at the horizon. Soon. The deputy was slightly stunned. However, Vern smiled and said, this is also the first order of that guy. Of course we have to act according to the orders of the boss. Boss? Let's think so for now. Rabin looked back at the battlefield. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 239. The main hall of Abi's castle was bustling with activity. Brando, Medisha, the Shire, Scarlet, and the Nightsong Tiger were all gathered together. They watched as the mercenaries carried a huge dusty map out of the basement and placed it on a long table. When the map was placed horizontally on the long table, everyone around the long table couldn't help but sigh softly. However, only the younger of the Wild Elf sisters asked, My lord, how did you know that bastard would put the map in the basement? After she finished speaking, she immediately looked at her elder sister carefully. Fortunately, Furlan didn't look for trouble with her this time and only glared at her in annoyance. In fact, the scene of Brando becoming an elementalist had shocked her to the core, and she was still in a daze. Brando knew that the bastard she was referring to was Groudon, but the once arrogant Baron was currently lying in the courtyard outside. He was not in the mood to collect the scum's corpse, and he might be able to use it in the future. He looked outside the main hall and saw the mercenaries gathering in the inner hall. Other than eliminating the remaining enemies, one of their tasks was to search for Bai Tiamas Chiyoyu, who had escaped. However, Brando knew that Bai Tiamas would not stay in Abi's castle. Even though Bai Tiamas lost miserably in their previous encounter, Bai Tiamas would not do anything meaningless. For example, staying here to give him trouble and vent his anger was not the habit of the Black Knights of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. If it was the Red Knight, Latios, then it would be possible. However, Bai Tiamas would never put himself in danger for no reason. This was one of the reasons why he was the most difficult to deal with among the four Knights of the Apocalypse. He would not leave any traces that could be used against him. Most of the nobles have the same habits, Tia. Brando replied while thinking. And I don't think Groudon was the one who put this map down. I doubt he has the will to govern this territory. His words were half true and half false. He knew that the map had nothing to do with the nobles' habits, but he knew exactly what was in the basement. Even though he wasn't one of the players who overthrew Groudon, he was still aware of the details of the incident. Brando looked at the map. It was probably a map left behind during the construction of Abi's castle. Naturally, it was not Groudon's handiwork. Perhaps it was left behind by the previous generations. The young wizard beside him frowned when he saw the map. This map has at least a few decades of history. The Shire coughed twice and said, doesn't he care about his territory at all? In the territory of the Black Tower Adepts, the Adepts redraw the map every year. Brando shook his head. You think everyone is a wizard? Furthermore, this is Trentheim, the most barbaric region in the whole of Aween. What else can you expect? He swept the dust off the map with his hand and replied, in this era, it's normal for the map of a small city like this to remain unchanged for a few decades. It's barely usable. Besides, we don't need such a detailed map right now. In this era? The Shire frowned and looked at him. You have a habit of saying that? Brando raised his head and rolled his eyes. Do you have a problem with that? No, the young wizard quickly shook his head. It's just that when you say it, my lord, it's filled with a sense of history. When you say it, my lord, you're already standing at the height of history. You're truly wise and mighty. Brando didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Enough with the nonsense. But he suddenly remembered something. Right, lucky hands? No, Falern, where's the equipment I asked you to organize? The elder of the Wild Elf sisters seemed to have just woken up. She was stunned for a moment and asked, what is it? Cleaning up the battlefield? Oh, Falern was slightly startled. Is it the remains of that skeleton? Speaking of which, there's something strange that I wanted to ask my lord. Something strange? Brando paused for a moment. The equipment dropped by a gold-ranked commander of Madara like Kabia's wouldn't be that bad. However, there were many strange equipment in the Amber Sword. Other than the low-level toys, all of the fantasy grade and above items were considered small artifacts by the players. That was why he couldn't help but be curious when he heard what Lucky Hands said. But just as he was about to ask, he saw Cornelius, who was sweating profusely, and a young man in a green-gray robe walking into the hall. Seeing the two of them, Brando's expression turned serious and he immediately interrupted Falern's words. He hurriedly asked Cornelius, how is it? We're well rested, my lord. We can set off at any time. Cornelius carefully glanced at him and replied. His words were like a signal, and everyone in the hall picked up their weapons and stood up from their seats. Even Scarlet, who had been chatting with Sifrid, patted her shoulder and stood up. Brando looked at them and nodded. Then let's set off. I'll leave Rabin's support to you, Lord Cornelius. I'll have Miss Medisha go with you. What's the situation on the other side? Medisha nodded to Cornelius after hearing Brando's words. Cornelius frowned and shook his head. We've already sent the signal, but there's still no news. I've already sent a scout to contact them, but they won't be back for a while. It's too late. Brando shook his head. We have to set off immediately. But my lord, I know Yuta, Cornelius suddenly said. Even if she doesn't arrive in time, she'll still do her best to delay Madara's undead. My lord, I don't think you need to worry too much. Brando interrupted him before he could finish. It's useless. They won't be able to delay the undead. I know Madara's usual tactics better than all of you. Under the encirclement of the endless skeleton army, unless they are in a defensive position, the 200 to 300 mercenaries are like stones thrown into the sea. In just a moment they will be reduced to ashes. He placed his hands on the table and looked at everyone, not to mention there's still the necromancers and dark warriors hiding among them. Brando straightened his back and picked up Scarlet's sword. The only thing we can do now is to set off immediately. The only thing left is to pray that Miss Yuta can reach the west gate in time. Otherwise there's only one outcome. The hall fell silent. Everyone looked at each other, but when they saw that Brendel did not say another word after he finished speaking, he picked up his sword and left his seat. They were stunned for a moment, but they still followed him one by one. At this moment, Seal lifted his head from the dusty map and asked calmly, so the worst outcome is to give up on Ferber City, right? My lord? Everyone was stunned. They didn't understand why the young adept would change the topic to this. But Brando stopped at the door and looked back at him. What did you think? I was just thinking that my lord is as daring as ever. Brando smiled faintly. Because the price is too high, he replied. I don't want to lose money. I can only choose the path with the highest returns, even if the risk is higher. But like I said, a dead man won't care if there's 1 or 2 ropes around his neck. That's true, but now I know that my lord and Miss Roman are a perfect match. Brando smiled. My lord. The Nightsong Tiger did not understand. The Shire's words are exactly what I plan to do, Brando nodded. Not only do I want to kill Groudon, but I also want to claim Tanajul. Count Randner wants to teach me a lesson, and I'll use this land that originally belonged to him to teach him a lesson. Victory or defeat is not only determined by strength, but also by wisdom. No one can win against the future. He stepped out of the door and looked back at the silver-haired middle-aged man who was the only outsider in the hall. Besides, who said that a new noble can only have 1 piece of land? Don't you agree, Cornelius? Cornelius was sweating profusely as he looked at Brando in a daze. There was only one thought in his mind: either I'm crazy or this young man is crazy. He's challenging the traditions of this ancient kingdom and the rules of the game between the nobles. Forcefully invading a noble's land, Martha above. If he succeeds, he'll overturn Erwin's ancient beliefs. The silver-haired middle-aged man lowered his head and thought of another possibility: they've all gone mad. However, the Shire had a different opinion from the mercenary leader. The young magus raised his head and asked without surprise, but now it seems that the risk is indeed very high. The undead are just outside the city, and if we give up Abes, my lord will lose the excuse to establish a foothold in Tonajal. So, my lord, what do you plan to do? Do you plan to hide in the forest and fight as a guerrilla? By the way, my lord, what did you say about the 16 words you taught me last time? Brendel smiled faintly and turned his head back. His gaze passed through the large arched door outside the corridor, and it was dark outside. But Brando knew that dawn was only a moment away. Perhaps the sun would rise from the horizon in the next moment. However, could Abes really hold out until the next moment? Man proposes, God disposes. The young man replied, since you've chosen the life of a gambler, then you should calm down and enjoy the thrill of a gambler. As for guerrilla warfare, he replied, don't worry, I'm also a descendant of a grandmaster. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 240. There are no enemies. There are no enemies on the left either. Those damn skeletons aren't here either. Shouts could be heard on the empty street. Yuta turned around. Her anxious dark green eyes reflected a faint light. Where did those undead go? The mercenary leader's slender fingers pressed on the handle of her rapier. The doubts in her heart were like a fog that gradually spread out. Everyone looked around in this fog, but they couldn't find anything. The mercenaries moved forward in the darkness. Their footsteps were rustling. The unknown was hidden in the silence of the night. Everyone's heart was imperceptibly cold. Fear was like a shadow hanging over everyone's head. It didn't need to speak, but it still grabbed everyone's throats. It was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was vigilant with their bright eyes in the dark. They were afraid that the undead, who had suddenly disappeared without a trace, would rush out from an alley and surround them so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. They crossed half of the city. They thought that they would encounter those bloodthirsty undead on the way and then engage in a life-and-death battle. But the enemy seemed to only exist in their imagination. The undead at the west gate didn't seem to exist at all. Could it be that the young noble made a wrong judgment? Yuta turned around. The light from the illuminating crystal in the young man's hand penetrated deep into her eyes, reflecting his pale face due to malnutrition. Leader? The young man asked. What? Could it be that the noble made a wrong judgment? He whispered, could it be that they went around to the north? Impossible, the mercenary leader firmly denied this judgment. Every second counts on the battlefield. The enemy's commander can't be an idiot. But the young man still wanted to say something, but someone in front of them shouted, Leader! Both of them were startled and looked in that direction at the same time. What's wrong? I found something, that person shouted, come and take a look. Yuta and the young man looked at each other, nodded, and followed. But when she turned the corner, she was stunned. The scene on the long street had completely changed. It was as if a fierce battle had taken place here. As far as the eye could see, there wasn't a single intact stone slab on the ground. All that could be seen were large pits one after another. The cracked stone slabs seemed to have been overturned by some kind of powerful force from the ground. Some of them were even thrown dozens of meters away. If it weren't for the fact that they couldn't feel any elemental disorder caused by the elemental power in the air, everyone present would have reason to believe that there had been at least a battle of gold-tier strength here. Yuta raised her head and saw a two-story building not far away from her. It had caved in and collapsed on one side. It looked as if the center of the building had been hit by something. The wooden beams that supported the structure were all broken. That kind of attack was at least at the level of silver. She took a deep breath and walked forward while looking at the skeletons and human corpses in the pit. Who are those people? The female mercenary group leader looked at the corpses and frowned. The corpses were dressed the same as the poor people outside the city. That was easy to explain, but what about the skeletons that were scattered around the corpses? She had observed carefully and found that the casualty ratio was close to 5 to 1. That meant that there were at least 5 skeletons beside each human corpse. If the poor people outside the city were this strong, Yuta wondered how Groton was able to survive to this day. The mercenaries shook their heads. Where are their weapons? She asked again. No weapons. The mercenary replied. No weapons. Yuta took a deep breath. Are you trying to tell me that these humans fought the undead with their bare hands, or that they are the Silver Folk? Leader, I don't know if they are the Silver Folk, but the first thing I want to say is that they are the Silver Folk. The mercenary who called out to them earlier lowered his head and answered softly. Yuta's eyes flashed. The things that happened tonight were beyond her understanding. At this moment, the sound of hooves could be heard from the street. Everyone looked up and saw 2 or 3 riders parting the night mist and stopping in front of them. They were the scouts that were sent out earlier. The female mercenary group leader immediately snapped out of her thoughts and asked, What's the matter? Did you find anything ahead? Leader, the rider immediately replied, There are sounds of fighting coming from the city gate. Sounds of fighting coming from the city gate? Does this mean that the refugees pushed the undead back? Everyone stopped and couldn't help but look at each other. Martha above, what kind of situation is this? The light in the darkness was not as simple as a white paint on a black background. Especially in the deep darkness, the only ray of light seemed to be the hope that flowed in people's hearts. Although they were not illuminated by it, they still wanted to move towards that ray of light. Even if it was just an imagination that existed in the heart, people were willing to trudge towards the direction of light in the darkness. Even if there was a deeper shadow behind them, they were willing to face the light. In the darkness, the light of the torch flickered. The girl quietly knelt in front of the torch. The red light of the torch outlined the soft lines of her cheeks. Between the light and the darkness, the beautiful lines extended to her neck and the shadows under the edge of her face. Her dark eyes reflected the light of the torch, as if there was a flickering flame in the deepest part of her pupils. She quietly pursed her lips and put her hands on her knees, motionless. It was as if everything in front of her had nothing to do with her. With a loud bang, a vine that could only be hugged by 2 people suddenly rose from the ground. Along with the gravel and soil, it formed a bough and whipped towards the white skeletons under the night sky. The vine, which was dozens of meters long, swept across the sea of skeletons. With a series of crackling sounds, countless broken skeletons were thrown high into the air and swept to the side. 3 tall men wearing animal skin robes with cold expressions stood on the city wall and commanded the vines. It was as if they were cleaning up garbage, and the vines repelled the skeletons that surged up from below again and again. The werewolves who stood beside them, even though they were half hunched over, were a head taller than the 3 men. They stared at the sea of undead with gloomy eyes, ready to repel the sneak attacks of the dark warriors and necromancers hidden among the undead. The battle had lasted for almost an hour. Finally, a tall werewolf walked to the girl's side and bowed his head respectfully. Miss Amandina, it seems that reinforcements have arrived. Amandina's eyes flashed. Who are they? She asked. They seem to be mercenaries. She turned back to look at the city wall and nodded without saying a word. She gently turned around and saw the merchant lady hugging her precious bag with both hands. Her upper body was completely sprawled on the battlements on the other side. She was sleeping soundly with her eyes closed. Her eyelashes drooped down like thick brushes. Her cheeks were rosy under the light of the fire. She looked so delicate and charming that it would make anyone want to take pity on her. Of course, that was if her mouth was not slightly open, and she was drooling in her sleep in an extremely indecent posture. Amandina sighed a little helplessly and reached out to pat the girl's face. Asterisk slap slap. Asterisk the Roman immediately smacked her lips and waved her hand subconsciously. She muttered softly, If you want to kill a Roman, please wait until I'm done sleeping. Amandina suddenly felt a sense of exhaustion. Roman. I know, the little Roman furrowed her eyebrows in her sleep. Please get a number and line up. Next, Yuta was shocked when she saw Amandina for the first time. The mature female mercenary leader could not help but frown as she looked at the strangely dressed people. The werewolves, druids, and the undead of Westgate were practically useless under their suppression. Not to mention that they were late. Even if they did not come, the outcome of the battle would not have changed at all. But she could not help but wonder who these people were. She did not know if these people were the young noble's subordinates, but if they were, did it mean that he did not trust her at all? Then that young man should have some follow-up measures on Rabin's side. She took a light breath. Even though she knew that this was normal, she still felt a little uncomfortable. It was as if she had made up her mind to work hard but was denied in the end. Even though she was mature and determined, she could not help but feel a little hopeful. Especially after witnessing the young man slaying Groton with his own hands during the night's battle, she had a faint glimmer of hope in her heart. She hoped that this was an opportunity to change her fate. Not just her but the entire mercenary group. In this chaotic world there was never a day of peace. She hoped that the young noble was a lord worth following, at least he could make her subordinates feel a sense of belonging. But nobles were all the same. No matter how different they were, they would only think about how to scheme against others all day long. That was why they were always suspicious of others and did not trust anyone. Even the young noble could not escape from this circle. The female mercenary leader tucked her fiery red hair behind her ears and fell silent at the thought of this. But Amandina raised her head and looked at the woman who was almost a head taller than her. Her expression was calm and did not move, as if she did not want to show any weakness. These should be the mercenaries that the Lord has subdued? She thought about it for a while and she had a rough idea of what he was thinking. But when she looked at the other party's every move, she suddenly understood. She seemed to have guessed the female mercenary leader's thoughts and asked, "May I ask who you are?" Jana looked at the little girl. Although the other party was much younger than her, she could still feel a faint sense of oppression from her. "Tsk, another noble lass." The female mercenary leader cursed in her heart, but when she opened her mouth, she spoke with a mocking tone. "Jana, leader of the mountain swallow mercenaries, we were sent by his lordship. Who are you, little girl? Here comes the test." Amandina smiled lightly in her heart, but her expression did not change as she replied, "I am also the Lord's subordinate. To be more precise, I am his chief advisor." She stretched out her hand. "This is a Roman lady, the Lord's fiancée." The merchant girl yawned and rubbed her eyes sleepily. As expected, Yuda's heart skipped a beat. A trace of disgust and disappointment flashed in her eyes. This trace of disappointment and disgust did not escape the noble girl's eyes. As expected, she had the same thought as Yuda, but her expression changed and she replied coldly, "But Miss Yuda, please do not be suspicious. Even though I am here as the Lord's advisor, it does not mean that I agree with his actions." She raised her head and looked at the female mercenary leader with a cold expression. "So, Miss Mercenary Leader, please help me tell the Lord, if he thinks that by being single and abandoning everything he can avoid harming others, I hope that he can abandon this naivety. Even though I do not know what kind of person the Lord wants to be, I know that a true hero is not a saint who does not make mistakes, but a man who dares to take responsibility. Even if it is a wrong decision, I hope that he understands that a person's life does not only belong to himself, but also to everyone who depends on him, cares for him, and loves him. Just like how I respect the Lord's decision, but I will never forgive him for abandoning his subordinates. Also, please tell him." Amandina suddenly stopped and looked into the distance. In this world there is no hope and freedom that can be obtained through charity without bloodshed and struggle. Amandina stopped and her last sentence was transmitted far and wide. A moment later, every werewolf on the city walls turned around and looked at the noble girl with an indescribable light in their eyes. Yuta was slightly taken aback. She looked at the girl and asked, "What do you mean?" Amandina did not answer. There was a dead silence on the city walls. The female mercenary leader looked at the Roman beside her, but the merchant girl only smiled sweetly at her and asked, "Auntie, the Roman wants to ask if you have a signal arrow?" Yuta was stunned. When the signal arrow rose from the west gate, the bright light of the fire illuminated the depths of everyone's eyes. Brando, the Shire, and Scarlet behind him stopped in an instant, and the mercenaries following them also stopped in an instant. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads to look at the resplendent light. It was like a prayer, a blessing telling everyone on the battlefield, telling them that they had won. Brando took a deep breath. If he was a gambler, then he would be the luckiest one. This was because the moment the roulette stopped, the needle of fate had precisely opened the door on the only path. As for what was behind the door, he might not be able to see it clearly, but at least he knew that he had won again. He had taken the first move from Madara and Groton's hands. However, at this moment, Charles turned back to look at his lord. The young wizard smiled and said, "So, after the darkness, it's already the dawn of the world? My lord?" "No," Brando looked at the ray of light and shook his head, "it's just that, I can already see the ending." Author's note, the last chapter of the Dusty Kingdom. It took some time to come up with this chapter, so I'm going to take a break after the explosion to think about the next chapter. I'm going to have to deal with the double monthly votes that are coming soon. Sigh. May the round God bless me, Godi Sagro. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.gdn.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 241. It's unusually quiet here, Gale said. The afternoon sun shone on the withered leaves, and the light in the forest was constantly changing. My lord. There's a legend among the mountain people. The reason why the forest is so quiet is because the goddess of the lake is watching over it. In such a place do not turn around, Tyrese said. The Viscount's pale hand rested on the hilt of his sword as he looked into the forest. There was a path of wild beasts. My lord, you must be joking. Gale felt a chill run down his spine as he looked around. It was as if there really was a pair of eyes hidden in the shadows. Chaos above, the gods are nothing but illusions. No, Gale, Tyrese replied, I believe that the gods are real. Gale looked at the young Viscount, as if he was trying to see the source of this heresy from his kind eyes. Turst was the son of all for one, and those who were chosen for this position had to be carefully selected by the higher-ups. Whether it was wisdom, talent, or loyalty to the teachings, he was one in a million. Even though his personality was fickle, it was still hard to believe that he would say such a thing. If there are gods, Gale replied, then what we're doing, is it not blasphemy? Tyrese looked at him as if he was mocking the young knight's weakness. If there are gods, he said, are they necessarily correct? I don't think so. Gale was speechless, and only then did he realize the difference between him and Tyrese. The young Viscount turned around and saw that at the edge of the forest, the knight had finally pulled the boat ashore. Let's be on our way, he snapped his fingers. In such a place we might run into something like a ghost at night. Even though it's not much of a threat, it's still troublesome. He held the hilt of his sword with one hand and swept the corner of his gray robe on the ground. Gale followed closely behind him. Not long after, a knight caught up with them. My lord, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 7th squads have all arrived, he reported in a low voice. We received a signal from the north, and other than us, the others have already reached the shore. As for the other teams, they didn't seem to be able to pass through the fog outside. Turst looked at the scenery of the forest with great interest, as if the light from the forest had melted into his narrow eyes, causing them to soften. So, he said, there are 37 of us, are there not? The knight nodded. 37 silver tears, including me, he pointed at himself, should be enough to deal with a knight of the lake. If the information is correct. Gale didn't answer. Turst turned around when he heard the rustling of footsteps in the forest. Gale's hand was still tightly gripping the hilt of his long sword, his nose hissing. How big is this island, my lord? He asked. Are you scared? Turst asked. Gale, the fisherman said that the knight of the lake will not appear outside White Mountain. Gale took a deep breath and released his hand stiffly. I'm sorry, my lord. Turst smiled good-naturedly. The group passed through the forest and met up with their companions in the north. They arrived at the holy white rock before the sun set in the afternoon. The afterglow fell on the white stone walls, dazzling them. The young Viscount placed his hand on the boulder in front of everyone. His slender fingers traced the uneven surface of the boulder, and the rough texture gave him a sense of history. It was as if he had gone back in time, thousands of years ago, to the time when a king came here with his sword and slumbered in this forest. There is a king here, he said. Do you know who it is? King Eric? Gale asked. No, Turst shook his head, it's not him. He lowered his hand and walked along the boulder. It didn't take long for them to find a cave that led to the interior of the boulder. Behind the cave was an emerald forest, which the natives called the Forest of Dreams. The young Viscount stopped and asked, Is this the place? Yes, my lord, the knight behind him replied. The information said that the knight of the lake is in the forest behind us. Then, are you all prepared with your weapons? Everyone patted the swords at their waist. Turst nodded with satisfaction. If that's the case, then follow me. Kaasabov, the knight replied. Brando sat in front of his walnut desk and suddenly felt the philosopher's slate tremble slightly. Again? He was slightly surprised. After a moment of confusion, he put down the quill in his hand and took out the philosopher's slate and placed it on the desk beside the letter. The sage slate trembled slightly, as if it had suddenly come to life on the wooden table. But after a while it calmed down. It did not move. What's wrong, my lord? Amandina asked and blinked her eyes. She sat quietly on a high-backed chair beside Brando, and the sunlight shone in from the window. Her posture was elegant, and her neck was as slender as a swan's. Brendel turned back to look at her, lost in thought for a moment. It's nothing. He used his hand to push the philosopher's slate lightly, but there was still no reaction. It's probably a low-frequency resonance, Brando thought for a moment. It's a common occurrence recently. He opened the drawer and placed the philosopher's slate inside. He then took out the quill from the ink bottle, but his train of thought was interrupted and he did not know where to start. Brando rubbed his temples as he felt a headache coming on. Are you writing a letter to Miss Freya? Amandina glanced at the letter on the desk. Yes, my head hurts. Brando replied, even though we killed Groton, the real trouble has only just begun. He raised his head again. Tell me, Amandina, how should we deal with Count Randner? Amandina raised her head and looked at him with a hint of annoyance. I thought my lord had a plan, she replied. Why didn't you ask for my opinion when you insisted on doing things your own way? If I gave up, Brando smiled, would you be at ease? Amandina turned her head away and did not say anything. Sundara, Brando thought to himself. He poked the quill on the paper and asked, by the way, what did you mean when you said those words to the mercenary leader? What I meant on the surface. I don't think so, Brando shook his head. I understand that you have complaints in your heart, but you and I both know that you're not someone who speaks without thinking, and you shouldn't say so much in front of an outsider. He took the parchment, crumpled it into a ball, and threw it out of the window. Aren't you smart, Amandina? I'm lucky to have a subordinate like you. Amandina looked back at him with a hint of admiration in her eyes. It was because my lord wanted to subdue the mercenaries, she replied. That's why I acted on my own accord. So you don't blame me? Brando breathed a sigh of relief. Thank the heavens. I've never blamed you, Amandina smiled faintly. I'm just a little angry that you left me behind. She furrowed her brows. I'm more worried that I won't be able to keep up with my lord's pace. I don't know, maybe there's something deeply rooted in my heart that will lead me further and further away. Brando smiled. I won't go too far if I have the heart. But he did not say it out loud and took out another piece of parchment. So you have an idea, Amandina? He asked. Amandina nodded. More or less. Amandina said, my lord is taking risks and I'm afraid we won't be able to resolve the danger we're about to face. But when it comes to conflicts between nobles, it's best to use a small force to gain a large one. First of all, we need to see if we can find a backer, but I'm afraid we can't rely on traditional means. Our foundation is still shallow, and no one will take the risk of offending Count Randner. We can consider his enemies, but our strength is too small, and our actions have already challenged the rules of the game. Amandina thought for a moment before continuing. The remaining options are those that don't make sense. For example, the Southern Legion. Madara isn't out of the question. Brando waved his hand. Forget about Madara, he replied. Tell me about the Southern Legion. Count Randner and Madara must have a few reasons for forming an alliance, Amandina replied. The first reason is to use Madara's hand to weaken the Southern Legion. The second reason is to allow them to suppress the strength of the Highlanders within Randner's borders. Have you noticed, my lord? Madara's undead army has not taken a single step into the lightning pool of the Goddess Lake. From the information we receive from the outside, they are most active in the autonomous regions of the Highlanders. Amandina continued, if that's the case, the Southern Legion will be isolated and without reinforcements. I'm afraid that they will hate Count Randner for not caring about them. However, the Southern Legion's garrisons are mostly barren lands or forests. The biggest problem they face is a lack of supplies. If we can form an alliance with them, we can at least guarantee that we won't have to worry about Count Randner's safety. You mean Madara? Amandina nodded. It's a good idea. Brando used his quill to scribble on the parchment. His gaze was focused on a point outside the window as if he was thinking about something, but the Southern Legion is currently in deep trouble. After the battle with Madara, they have already cut off all contact with the outside world. Whether or not this organization still exists is a problem. Even if it does, how to contact them is another problem. He stopped writing and took a deep breath. We can't rely on luck, so this idea can only be used as a backup plan. I can send people to Mount Gralas, but before we receive any concrete information, this is only a safety measure. Is there anything else to consider? What about the silver elves that my lord met? Can they be of help? Amandina asked. If we're talking about borrowing strength, they're the biggest help. P.S. I'm designing the later parts of the story. Chapter 242. Silver Elves? Brando tilted his body and rested his chin on one hand. Of course, but the friendship with the Silver Folk is one of the last cards I can use. I will try my best to avoid using this card until the very end. He asked, is there anything else? Amandina looked at the yellowed letter under the young lord's pen. Other than parchment and sedge, most of Tanagel's paper came from a certain paper tree, in the Grimoires region in the south. The locals called this tree Duwei gold, meaning the tree that produced gold. Most of these papers were sent to the rich provinces of Ampere Seal, Cipher or Corvado. But now, this trade relationship was unilaterally cut off because of the imminent civil war. The girl blinked and thought of the current situation. My lord, she looked up, do you want? She suddenly frowned, but even if the princess's faction is weak, they might not be interested in us. Besides, compared to us, the royal faction is obviously more unwilling to offend Count Randner. You hit the nail on the head, Amandina. Brando folded the second letter and crumpled it into a ball. But what if we don't borrow power but instead divert it? What will happen? He said as he threw the crumpled paper out. Divert it? This letter is indeed addressed to Princess Griffine Corvado Orderfis, Brendel replied. It's meant to give us a chance to breathe from the pressure we've been under. He flipped the tip of his quill and pushed the quill and the paper towards the noblewoman. You write it. A letter to Her Highness? Amandina took the pen and paper, took a light breath and pressed the tip of the pen on the paper. How do I write it? You decide on the format and the content is written like this. Brando snapped his fingers. On the 17th of the month of autumn's twilight, written in Tonajal, Baron Abies Fief, by Her Highness Griffine Corvado Oderfis. During the battle 2 nights ago, in Sursta, the Black Lord's undead army, led by Matter, bypassed the 4 southern territories and launched a sneak attack on Abies Castle. Not only did they cause a lot of casualties but Grodin also died in the battle. As a pioneer knight of the kingdom and the Lord of Valhalla, your humble servant believes that I have the duty to temporarily assume responsibility for the defense of this place, thanks to the Baron's hospitality and my dual identity as the Lord of Valhalla. After a night of fighting, the undead have been repelled. However, to prevent the undead from invading again from today onwards, I will temporarily lead the defense and administrative work of this place. He paused for a moment. Until the arrival of the new lord personally appointed by Her Highness, Brando looked at the noble women who were engrossed in writing, and the scratching of the pen was like a whisper in his ear. Continue, he said, and I will question Count Randner's responsibility. Why did he conceal the fact that Insursta's undead army had stopped in the south, and why did he let Madara's army pass through the 4 territories without alerting anyone? Secondly, I hope that Her Highness will forgive me. Lastly, I will attach a magic stone that recorded the images of the battlefield as proof of my words. Amandina raised her head in surprise. A magic stone? She asked, where did this come from? Just as she finished her sentence, there was a knock on the door. Knock knock knock. The young lord raised his head and answered, and the door opened. The one who came in was Falerne, the elder of the Wild Elf sisters. She looked at the 2 people in the room and then walked to Brando's side. My lord. She answered in a flat tone, and placed a grayish-white stone orb covered with fine patterns beside Brando's hand. This is what you wanted. Today the elven lady was wearing a tight leather armor with a simple short skirt. Her thin golden hair was tied up behind her head, making her look natural and capable. Are you done with the inspection? Brando asked. Falerne nodded. Amandina recognized that the orb in Falerne's hand was a magic stone. It was a magical item made by the mages of Buga, and it was able to record and transmit images. Before the establishment of the Silver Union, the mages and craftsmen had discovered a type of quartz that could record images for a short period of time, 1 or 2 days. However, the silver folk had channeled the quartz into a magic circle to create magic stones that could store images for decades. Magic stones were not rare, but the noblewoman took a closer look at the young man. My liege had prepared everything yesterday, she thought to herself. My liege may be impulsive but he is not reckless. Brando put away the orb and said to Amandina, with this letter we will have to see how Princess Griffine Corvado Oderfis will react. But I believe that Her Highness is a smart person, and I believe that she will make good use of this opportunity. You are familiar with Her Highness? Amandina grasped the crux of the matter with her unique sensitivity. My lord? A girl who can leave the turbulent Corvado alone, sneak back to her own territory, and borrow the power of the royal faction to oppose her brother, is this not mature enough? Brando turned around and answered, Amandina, don't forget that she is not yet 16 years old. He paused for a moment. Even if we take 10,000 steps back, the people around her are not deaf or blind. The royal faction has experienced the power struggle in the palace, and they should be able to see the meaning behind this letter. He took the letter from Amandina's hand and flicked it. The paper made a rustling sound. Count Randner is wavering between the regional faction and the royal faction. Both sides are happy to see a variable like us appear to pressure him, Brando replied. So the key to this letter is not whether what is written in it is true, but how true it can appear. If the royal faction obtains this letter, it will be an opportunity to force Count Randner to take a stand. Choosing to be a pawn is a good choice when we are at a disadvantage, Amandina frowned. But once Count Randner leans towards the royal faction, we will be abandoned. It's not that simple, the young lord shook his head. Count Randner is an old fox and he is cautious by nature. How can he be easily manipulated by one side? He has an indecisive personality, and once he is pressured, his anger will be replaced by vigilance. This way, at least temporarily, the pressure on us will be relieved. But in the long run, as long as we have time to breathe, there will be variables for us. He waved the letter and answered, in the end, strength determines fate. Amandina glanced at him but quickly lowered her eyes. Brando had told them in private that he was just a knight from the frontier, but how could a knight from the frontier know so many secrets? Only those who had received special education could know the traditions and personalities of nobles like the back of their hands. Even though the mysteries of the youth were revealed one by one, Amandina was more and more certain that there was a story behind him. She was not the only one. Most of the people who followed Brando believed so as well. But we killed his son. Amandina was a little confused. Are we going to let it go just like that? For an old noble family, compared to status and power, their children are nothing. Amandina answered calmly, Grodin is not Count Randner's only son, but he will not let this matter rest for the sake of his family's honor. No matter when, we will still have to face Count Randner's army. Brando nodded in agreement with Amandina's words. Pawns also need to have value, he replied. We need to show the princess that we can pressure Count Randner. If we don't even have the ability to stand on our own, no one will be willing to invest in us. Invest in us? It's like a gambler placing a bet. Brando explained, a good gambler doesn't just believe in luck. Amandina nodded to show that they understood. But Brando put down the letter and took out another one from the drawer. He said to Amandina, Amandina, make another copy of this letter. Amandina was stunned. This letter is for Reto and the others. We will have to fight Count Randner and Grodin's retainers soon. The young lord replied, I can only rely on the mercenaries outside, but I don't know if they are reliable or not. He glanced at the door. You know that I don't like to rely on uncertainties, so I need them to give up on their original plans and meet up with me here. Amandina opened the letter and read its contents. A trace of surprise flashed in her eyes. She thought for a moment and suddenly raised her head. How do you plan to deal with the people in the Green Village? This was a question that Brando had been thinking about for a long time. He could see that the werewolves were willing to follow him, but they did not dare to speak up because of their lowly status. But he did not care about this. The Green Village had a population of more than 300, and because of the werewolves' natural constitution and the harsh environment of the dark forest, more than half of them were iron-ranked warriors. Disregarding other factors, they could be considered a powerful force to be reckoned with. He pondered for a moment. The heroine might not be able to accept the Xenia for the time being. The only way is to have them return to the Green Village temporarily. When I find that place, I will need a large number of people. That place? Amandina were surprised. A fantasy land called Valhalla. You will understand soon enough. Brando tapped on the table with his finger. By the way, what's up with the druids? I haven't asked you yet, Amandina. That's just a coincidence, Amandina replied. I didn't expect them to come when I encouraged the villagers. But I think, she raised her head and looked at Brando. They're here for Sifrid. Sifrid? Brando furrowed his brows slightly. I've almost straightened it out and will explode tomorrow. I'm looking for double the amount of votes next month. I've realized that I've been chased out a lot. I'm looking for subscriptions and recommendations. If you want to know what's going to happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Chapter 243. Just as Brando was about to mention Sifrid's name, the door to the room was pushed open without warning. The young lord's mouth froze as he felt a little annoyed. Who was so rude? He turned around and saw the most unique of the three faces outside the door. It was a man with dark skin with rocky edges and deep-set eyes. His hair was braided and fell on a bearskin coat. Sir, at this time you can't. The mercenary who had been forced to retreat into the room stopped abruptly. He turned around and looked at the young lord apologetically. My lord, The mercenary who had been forced to retreat into the room stopped abruptly. He turned around and looked at the young lord apologetically. My lord, Brando waved his hand indicating that it was fine. He raised his head and looked at the tall druid standing motionlessly by the door. He recognized the druid's name as Andrew, one of the elders of the Withering Tree Council. The two men behind him were Rend and Ramu, both of them from the younger generation of the Forest Council. The mercenary left the room and closed the door behind him, and the room became quiet. Andrew's eyes were sharp as a hawk's as he looked at the furnishings in the room. Since the battle had just ended, the room was still decorated in the dark red style that Groton favored. However, there was a pungent smell coming from the thick carpet that made him frown. When the guards left, Amandina stood up angrily. "What are you doing?" Even though she was petite, she did not back down. "How can you just barge in like that?" Brando sighed when he heard her words. These beasts really don't know how to interact with humans in a civilized world. He stopped Amandina and looked at Sifrid, who was standing behind the three druids. Every time he looked at the little girl's long green hair that flowed like a waterfall, he could not help but feel a sense of freshness. Sifrid hid behind the three druids who were as tall as a bear and smiled shyly at him. Brando's expression softened a little and he asked, "So, what's going on here?" He was certain that the druids were here for Sifrid. The druids of the forest were a special force in the Amber Sword. They abided by their agreement with Sifrid and lived in the dark forest beyond the borders of civilization. Other than recording the effects of the magic moon on the animals in the wilderness, they also monitored the growth of the dark forest. Some of the druids had a good relationship with the locals and would occasionally come out of the dark forest to warn the locals of the invasion of monsters. But the druids of the Withering Tree Council did not belong to that group. Something must have happened in the dark forest for them to appear here. What to do with Sifrid? "Lord Viscount," Andre replied stiffly, "we have come to take Sifrid away." "What do you mean?" he asked as he looked at Sifrid. But the little girl avoided his eyes, lowered her head and nodded. This made him feel a little strange. "So," Brando looked at the three druids, "what business do you have with me?" "It's like this, my lord," the youth who had been standing behind Andelu interjected. "Even though we have sought the opinion of Miss Sifrid, her father, and the village elder, Miss Sifrid still insists on obtaining my lord's permission before leaving." "Is that so?" Brando lowered his head to look at Sifrid. "That's right," Sifrid whispered, "Brother Brando." The young lord looked at her, then at Andrew's party. He pondered for a moment, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt that something was amiss. "So what's the matter?" he asked with a frown. "Just tell me." "Miss Sifrid has requested for us to form an alliance with you, my lord." Andrew's light gray eyes fell on Erwin's body, as if he was sizing up a certain part of Erwin's old nobility system. He said, "Because it's said that you got into trouble in order to save her." Andrew's stiff Kurlut's language was rather forceful. "We've considered it and it's not unacceptable, but there are a few conditions." "Wait," Brendel frowned and waved his hand to interrupt them. "I'm not interested in human trafficking. You better tell me what's going on from the beginning to the end." The room fell silent, and Amandina and Falerne turned their heads to look at him. The three druids looked at each other and Andrew spoke up. "Very well, my lord. The reason why the three of us left the forest is because of the saint's prophecy." Brando raised his eyebrows slightly, but he continued to listen patiently. The druid elder continued, "The prophecy mentioned that a little girl will inherit Lady Sifrid's will, and will be born in this land." He paused for a moment. "And we believe that this little girl is Sifrid." "Apocalypse?" Brando nodded. "In the world of Wond, even though the gods were incarnated into the laws of nature, they still had the power to influence the world. When this power interfered with the history of mortals, an oracle would be sent down. This was the prophecy of the saint. But when he looked at Sifrid, the first thing that came to his mind was whether the druids were lying to him. A druid would never joke about the name of the forest god, unless they were imposters. But of course they were not imposters. The druid's magic could not escape Brando's eyes. This news surprised him. If Sifrid was born because of the saint's will, then she was not a chosen. Brando then thought of Groton's actions against Sifrid. Perhaps the undead of Madara had received some sort of revelation from this prophecy. Furthermore, the Baron might have also received this information from the skeletons. If that was the case, then the previous mystery could be explained. It seems that the relationship between Count Randner and Madara isn't as simple as just using each other. Based on this prophecy, there's a possibility of a deeper alliance between them. But if the prophecy involves the druids and Madara's undead at the same time, then it might not be as simple as Naya. Brando could not help but think that the forest goddess and the undead were enemies, and Madara was under the protection of the darkness dragon. In this way things became complicated. How can you be sure that the person mentioned in the prophecy, Brando asked seriously, is Sifrid? My lord, we have the means to confirm it. Reed replied. Means? Andro nodded and immediately bowed to Sifrid. Miss Sifrid, can you please turn around? The tall druid bowed down to a little girl who was less than half his height, looking like a clumsy bear. It was rather comical. Sifrid nodded obediently and turned around. She parted her hair behind her beautiful little ears, allowing Brando to see a beautiful pattern on the back of her snow-white neck. It was a leaf-shaped pattern that was derived from a thumb-sized emerald in the middle of her neck, forming a vein. When Brando saw the pattern, he almost jumped up from his chair. Naya's sacred rune. He shouted in a low voice, his hand holding the table tightly. He blurted out subconsciously, Marcia above, daughter of the forest. Andro nodded to Sifrid, and the little girl let her hair down again. She turned around and smiled shyly. But the tall druid's expression turned serious as he looked at Brando. My lord, Andro asked, do you know of this legend? You mean the saintess of the forest? Brando calmed himself down and nodded. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm not Viscount Gaston, but I used that identity to deceive Grodin. You can call me Brando. I'm a Highland knight. The Shire is my retainer. He paused for a moment. In fact, I've learned a lot of things from my mentor, and I also heard about the legend of the saintess of the forest. Brando finished telling the old lie, and the three druids did not raise any objections. Instead, they were enlightened. Brando's claim that wizards were knowledgeable was the best excuse for him to hide his identity. Besides, the Shire would never help him expose this lie anyway. But when they heard the young lord's next sentence, their expressions changed. The saintess of the forest is the founder of Valhalla? Valhalla? Andro almost rushed over and grabbed Brando's collar, but after taking a step forward, he remembered that this ordinary-looking young man was actually a terrifying gold-ranked warrior. He paused for a moment and asked, My lord, you said that Valhalla is related to the saintess of the forest? The fantasy country that only exists in legends? You don't know about it? Brando was surprised. The saintess of the forest was Naya's chosen one, the daughter of the forest. She was the only inheritor of the bloodline of Valhalla, and she had a considerable connection with this group of druids. He found it hard to believe that they did not know anything about it. But he still shook his head. Valhalla does not only exist in legends. On the contrary, it has always existed in this forest. But I'm curious. You have been living in this forest all this time, and yet you don't know anything about it. The druids looked at each other and whispered to each other for a while before they calmed down. The existence of Valhalla has always been a legend in this area. According to the rumor, this dusty country is one of the first few places left behind by Lady Martha, Rum said. No one can confirm the story from such a long time ago. But rumor has it that there is a primordial flame in Valhalla. If it can be reignited, the Black Forest south of Tonajul will become a place of order. He could not help but gulp. In this way, the druids of the Deadwood Council, who have been guarding the land for generations, can finally come to an end, and we can also answer to Lady Naya. So, Brando glanced at them. This is the meaning of the apocalypse. 1. Goddess of the forest. 2. A kind of wilderness. The Black Forest was a vast forest located on the border of Wonde, outside of civilization. It was widely distributed from the south of Erewhon, all the way to Saint Tassol, the Knight's Nation, Grace, and even the area on the border of Iranta. Long before the Dark Age, humans had learned to explore and open up new places in the Black Forest. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 244. Wait a minute, Andelu interrupted Brando. My lord, what do you mean when you say that Valhalla has always existed in this forest? Just like what I said on the surface. Brando replied. The druid shook his head. That's impossible, he said with certainty. If Valhalla is in the forest, there's no way we wouldn't have sensed it. Andelu suddenly realized that the youth was trying to trick him. They were only here for Sifrid in the first place. But Andelu had accidentally revealed so much, some of which were even related to the core of Naya's prophecy. He paused for a moment and stopped abruptly. Sir, let's return to the topic at the beginning. Sifrid has given me full authority to decide on this matter. If you can't convince me, don't even think of taking her half a step out of this territory. Brendel shook his head. Sifrid has given me full authority in this matter. If you can't convince me, don't even think of taking her half a step out of this territory. Andelu raised an eyebrow, but Brendel interrupted him. There's no need for unnecessary words. My understanding of you druids is no less than your understanding of yourselves. Brando said coldly, whether it's melding with the stone or forest steps, I have a way to capture you. You can give it a try. When Andelu heard Brando's words, he immediately gave up on the idea of forcibly taking Sifrit away. Mortals had a very shallow understanding of druids, but this young man in front of him was obviously an exception. If he knew what he was thinking, it would not be an empty threat. He hesitated for a moment before replying, Then my lord, what do you mean? We have already made our words clear, and I believe that you can trust us. We swear in Naya's name that we have no intention of harming Miss Sifrit. We are only taking her to complete the necessary ritual to become a druid. You don't want to ignite the fire seed of Valhalla? Brando asked. The three druids were stunned. What are you trying to say, my lord? The youth called Rend, who was standing behind Andelu, finally spoke up. Of course we want to ignite the fire seed of Valhalla. This is one of our main objectives in the Dark Forest. The druids also believe in Lady Martha, and this is a promise that we have always kept. He replied, But forgive me for being blunt, my lord, but I don't quite understand what you mean. My meaning is simple, Brando replied. Valhalla has always existed in the Dark Forest. He looked at Sifrit and suddenly realized something. I understand now. You must have misunderstood something. The fire seed of Valhalla. The saintess of the forest did not mean igniting the fire seed, but activating a part of Valhalla's ability. The young man paused for a moment and leaned back on the chair with a playful look on his face. He crossed his fingers and said, Let's make a deal. What deal? Help me find Valhalla and I'll light the fire seed for you, Brendel said slowly. So you can become the Lord of Valhalla as a Knight of Valhalla? Andrew glanced at the young man and realized for the first time what he was thinking. Actually, this suggestion is not impossible. We druids have no desire for power. However, he changed the topic and replied, I still want to say it again. Valhalla is not in the forest. It is just a legend. Brando shook his head. All right, let's put it another way. I don't want you to help me find Valhalla. I want you to go deep into the Dark Forest and help me find some ruins. Ruins? There are ruins in the Dark Forest? Ren suddenly whispered, Elder, the ruins we found last time in the Loop of Wind? Are you sure that the ruins are Valhalla? Andrew suddenly reacted and glared at Brendel, questioning, Are you sure the ruins are Valhalla? I've seen it with my own eyes and it's just a pile of rubble. Humans have ventured deep into the Dark Forest several times, and it's normal for them to leave behind ruins. But we've already searched the area thoroughly, and we didn't find anything related to the fire seed. Brando listened and checked in his mind. He asked, The Loop of Wind you speak of, is it the monsoon path around the Kalanga Mountains? The druid elder was startled for a moment and then nodded. Then it's correct. Brando replied with certainty. He knew that Valhalla was built on the monsoon path around the Kalanga Mountains, so the abundant rain from the Dead Moon Sea in the summer allowed the crops in the territory to flourish. But this wasn't the key point. Brando suppressed his excitement. How long ago did you find the ruins? Andelu was infected by his seriousness and couldn't help but become serious. About 3 years ago. Can you still confirm the direction? It's hard to say, Andelu shook his head. In fact, it was an accident that we found the ruins. At that time, we went deep into the Kalanga Mountains to investigate the ecology of the Dark Forest. If we want to find the place now, I'm afraid we'll have to send out another expedition team to confirm it. But with the general direction, it won't take much time. He raised his head. Does my lord want to go with us? Brando shook his head. No, I don't have the time now. He replied, This deal is done. Send someone to find the place and inform me immediately once there's definite news. He looked at the three druids. This deal was in his favor, but Brando knew that the druids didn't consider it that way. These people who lived in the Dark Forest didn't care about fame and wealth, and to deal with them, one had to understand what they were interested in. And the fire seed of Valhalla was an irresistible temptation to these druids. Andelu and the two youths behind him nodded as expected. In their eyes, Brando's proposal was also beneficial to them. Amandina had been listening to their conversation since the beginning, and she found it difficult to interrupt. But she finally found a chance to speak. When Andelu agreed to Brando's proposal, she immediately opened her mouth. You took Sifrit away, but her relatives in the Green Village are all in the Baron of Abes. Have you not considered the possibility that Count Randner's vengeance will descend upon us at any time? Andrew glanced at the noble's daughter. Her words made him frown. Don't worry, my lord. When I return to the council, you will receive the druid's aid. But like we said before, we have a condition. Brando looked at Sifrid, and the latter nodded. Speak, he said. Our duty is only to protect your forces in the Ferber barony, the druid said as he looked at the young man. It was as if he could see the ambition in the young man's eyes. He knew that the young man's intentions were far beyond that. But he did not want the druids to be tied to Brando's war chariot, so he reminded him, other than this, we will not provide any more help. He was waiting for the expected bargaining, but Brando nodded instead. The druids have always been neutral. I'm satisfied that you can say so. Let's leave it at that. He thought for a moment and added, but there's one more thing. The area of protection includes Valhalla. Andela was stunned for a moment before he nodded, of course. Brando was laughing in his heart. These fellows must have been stupid after staying in the forest for so long. Even though he was much more experienced than Grodin, he was still only at this level. The druids were able to predict his plan, but they neglected the ambitions of the other nobles. Just like Tanagel's current situation, Count Randner would not let this matter rest, and war was inevitable. Moreover, even if the war ended, the other nobles would still covet Valhalla's legendary territory. The greed of the human heart was endless, and it was only a matter of time before they boarded the war chariot. Brando knew that he had to save the crumbling Erewhon from the fate of destruction. In order to fight against the great inertia of history, he had to obtain more help. Tanagel's druids were an opportunity, and a part of his plan. This was a step forward, and no matter how big or small it was, history would change forever. But he stopped and looked at Sifrid. Sifrid, becoming a druid is not an easy task. Even though you are the chosen one of Goddess Nia, a person's fate is still in their own hands. Even if you stay here, you can still learn a lot. He paused for a moment and his voice became gentler. So you still want to go with Andelu and the others? His words made everyone look at him in surprise, especially Andelu and the others. In their minds, Brando was no different from the other nobles in Erewhon, but at this moment, there was a slight change in their view. Sifrid hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded her head. I want to go, Brother Brando, she replied. What? Falerne looked at the three of them suspiciously. She did not understand the druids as well as Brendel did, and she was furious at him for handing over Sifrid, but she could not refute him due to her status. Isn't it good for you to be here, Sifrid? Why do you want to go to the forest? Sifrid raised her head and looked at Amandina. Because of Sister Amandina, she answered seriously. Me? Amandina was surprised. Sister Amandina and father said that it is impossible to not rely on yourself, Sifrid replied in a crisp voice. Brother Brando is very good to me, but I can't accept it with a clear conscience. Uncle Andelu said that when I become a druid, I'll have the same abilities as them. She paused for a moment to catch her breath. At that time, I'll have the ability to protect the villagers. Brando's gaze softened. Well said, he replied. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 245. Brando walked to Sifrid's side and placed his hand on her shoulder. Sifrid is a sensible child. He raised his head and looked at the tall druid elder. I treat her as my own sister, and I'm entrusting her to you according to her wishes. As for whether or not she can become a citizen of the forest, in Vaunt, another name for druids, I don't care, but I ask that you must ensure her safety. He paused and his tone became more serious. Can you do it? Andelu nodded. There's no need for you to say it, my lord. Thank you, Brother Brando. Sifrid held onto the corner of her clothes with both of her hands and replied obediently. Brando smiled faintly and patted her forehead. The little girl's seriousness and sensibility were naturally lovable no matter where she went, but Brando did not mind her request to form an alliance with the druids. He could see that Andelu was unwilling at first, but since they had Valhalla as a connection, it was only natural for them to form an alliance. He turned to Amandina and said, Amandina, bring Sifrid to prepare the things we need for the journey. Amandina looked at Andelu as if she had just recovered from her thoughts. She looked at Brando with a puzzled expression. I'm going? Of course, Brando replied. Even though Sifrid is still a child, she's still a girl. Only a girl like you would know what to bring. Otherwise, we can only let the Roman do it for us. He smiled and changed the topic. But are you okay with leaving Sifrid in her hands? Amandina thought of Romaine's carefree attitude. She was afraid that Romaine would fill Sifrid's little backpack with her favorite glass beads. even though she had spent a lot of effort to buy them from the merchants back in Bucci. She sighed, but, can't Scarlet do it? She's not as attentive as you. Brando replied. Amandina glanced at him and felt an inexplicable joy in her heart. But when she saw Brando's gaze, she knew that he had something else to say. She thought for a moment and asked, "Is there anything else, my lord?" "Inform Cornelius to come see me," Brando replied. Amandina nodded and walked over to Sifrid's little hand. She took the little girl's hand and led her out of the door and closed it behind her. When they left, the only people left in the room were Brendel, Andrew, and Brendel, as well as the elven girl who was hugging a record book. "Do you have any other orders, Sir Overlord?" Andrew looked at the ambitious young man and asked. Even though he was not a worldly man, he knew that Brendel did not simply send Sifrid away to prepare her luggage. "We are druids and we don't know how to beat around the bush. My lord, please speak your mind." "I'm very busy, so I won't be sending you off for the rest of your journey," Brando replied. "I do have some things to say. I know that you don't think our alliance is essential, my lord." Rant, who was behind Andrew, frowned and interrupted him. But he immediately saw Brando waving at him. "Wait for me to finish." Brando opened his mouth. "I know the druid's attitude towards the dark forest, and I also know the agreement between you and Naya. This is your tradition, but I also have something to tell you. The power of chaos is very strong. You're a member of All for One?" Andelu's eyes turned cold. "Silver Sky Snake? Tree herders or sheep's head cultists?" "I thought you would put the tree herders at the front." The druid snorted coldly. "Neither." But Brando shook his head. "Those people you're talking about are all my enemies. But the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend." "Indeed," the young suzerain said without hesitation. "But you and I both know that this era is coming to an end, and the demon moon is about to reach its peak. The last magic tide ended the era of chaos, and no one knows what will happen this time. In such an environment, it is no different from a fantasy for you to suppress the growth of the dark forest." "So what?" "I know much more about the dark forest than you do." Andelu crossed his arms and looked at the young man with extreme suspicion. They were people who had dealt with the dark forest all their lives, but now a stranger told them that he knew more about the forest than they did. This feeling was even more ridiculous than showing one's slight skill in front of an expert. It was simply arrogance for no reason. Brando just smiled. "It doesn't matter if you don't believe it. Think back, before the era of chaos, the area of Wond was less than a quarter of what it is today. Who opened up such a vast territory and turned the thorny dark forest into the land of civilization today?" Andelu was a little proud. "It was the druids." Brando still shook his head. "To be exact, it was the ancient druids of the Ring of the World. After the fall of the Tower of Babel, the dark dragon scattered the druids in the wilderness, and the Ring of the World was divided into the tree herders and the orthodox druids today." He paused. "I don't need to say this, do I? My lord is indeed knowledgeable." "No, it's just that we have something in common." Brendel sighed deliberately. "Ever since the fall of the Tower of Babel, there has been a rift between the ancient magic system and the modern magic system. Both the druids and the wizards are looking for the ancient heritage, but I happen to know a member of the dragon clan, and I happen to know some of the doctrines of the druids." "You know ancient magic?" Andelu's eyes flashed and became sharp. He knew that the only known golden tribe in this world was the dragon clan. Dragons were also the only existences that understood ancient string magic. Although druid magic was an even more mysterious type of runic magic, mysterious knowledge was often shared. Moreover, since Brando said so, he must have some hidden meaning. If he still didn't understand, he would be a real fool. Awasimers. Brando almost finished the incantation word by word. "Have you heard of the Seed of Life?" He raised his head and asked. "You should understand the meaning of this sentence." The three druids' faces suddenly changed. The seed of life that Brando spoke of was the seed of the elven tree. The tree herders often transformed this thing into the golden demon tree, but the sacred tree of life was the only tree they found that could effectively transform the dark forest. It was just that the tree of life was originally rare, and other than artificial cultivation they could only look for the ancient heritage in the ruins. After all, it was an ancient heritage. They all heard that the passage that Brando recited was a transformation incantation. The core rune was Im, which represented the earth. It was very likely that it was the language of nature, of the ancient druid magic. Legend said that it could directly purify the dark forest completely and save it from the erosion of magic. However, that kind of magic had not existed in this world for more than 1,000 years, if not for some records in the ancient books. At most, The three of them could only hear that the incantation had some connection with druid magic. Andelu looked at Brando with a complicated expression. Language of nature? Brando nodded. My lord, you know this spell? Are you a druid? Brando shook his head. In fact, he was not unfamiliar with this thing because the incantation was written on the ancient slate. In the later stages of the game, almost every player more or less knew something about it. However, just knowing it was not enough to use it because the only thing that supported this incantation was the ancient slate. The Wizard War later broke out because of this reason. Simply put, this was a gimmick. It looked beautiful, but it was actually worthless. However, it was enough to attract the attention of these druids. As expected, Andelu frowned. What does that mean? Simply put, I am also interested in the dark forest, Brando replied. However, the stronger the order, the stronger the resistance from the chaos. Therefore, fighting alone is not the best way to solve the problem. As he spoke, he picked up a candle from the table. Druids are used to solving problems from the perspective of the world and the laws of nature, but the goddess of the forest has actually pointed out another path for you. What path? Andelu asked. Brando carefully used scissors to cut off a forked part of the candle's wick and then lit it. He looked up and said, that is to borrow the power of others. He replied, since the year of chaos, other than the limited traditional model of the church, pioneer knight, the civilization has rarely expanded the scope of the guarded lands. However, because of the lack of territory and the erosion of magic, the wars between the civilizations have increased day by day. He paused and changed the topic. However, I intend to open up a new model to end all of this. Even if it's just a trial. The young lord smiled slightly. However, I am very confident. I just don't know if you are interested. Andelu lowered his head and pondered for a moment. My lord, you can just say it. What I mean is, Brando said as he picked up the envelope on the table. He tilted the candle slightly and let the hot wax drip on the envelope. To transform Erewhon into a country full of vitality and constantly expanding outwards. The three druids gasped in unison. Andelu had expected Brando's ambition, but he did not expect the young man's ambition to be so great. His goal was not as simple as being a vassal, but to change this ancient kingdom. They could even hear that his tone was far more than that. The expansion of Erewhon. This young man wanted to build an empire with his own hands. Ambition was a good thing for some people, but it caused Andelu to feel deeply uneasy. He looked at Brando vigilantly. Expansion will bring bloodshed and war, which is contrary to our beliefs, he said in a low voice to avoid making the other party unhappy. Therefore, my lord, if you want to use this to entice us to join you, I'm afraid you are wrong. War is inevitable. Brando put down the candle and took off the ring of the Wind Empress. However, for me, war is a means to protect myself. Because I'm afraid you have misunderstood the meaning of expansion. Wait, you mean? Andelu interrupted him in disbelief. Brando nodded seriously. The expansion I'm talking about is the barbarian lance. He pressed the ring of the Wind Empress on the wax and then raised it. Using the power of the country, we will open up new territories in the barbarian lands. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 246. The expansion I'm talking about is aimed at the wilderness. Using the power of the kingdom, we can open up new territories in the wilderness. Brando replied, pausing between each word. Then he stopped what he was doing and looked up at Andrew, who was looking at him with a complicated expression. The druid elder took a light breath, but he still did not believe it. But the law of nature is a cycle, and as the lord of a land you can make things simple. But it's like a force, where there's oppression, there's resistance. You pushing all this with your own power may be a good thing for the world of order, but others may not agree. The elder paused and changed his way of answering. Opening up the borders of civilization is a dangerous and difficult thing, especially in this day and age. My lord, will you take the risk of being opposed by the majority to push all this? It's actually not that difficult. Profit will always drive people to act. Brando replied. He could not help but think that this was just like how gold and silver drove the Portuguese and the Spanish to fight to go out to sea. He was just repeating the path that Prince Enrique had taken. Besides the Holy Cathedral, he was probably the only one who knew how much value there was in the wilderness. It was just that the Holy Cathedral had to measure the ratio of investment to return, and he had a ready-made example. The return from the wilderness will naturally be the motivation for Erewhon to move forward. And people are always forgetful. When there's gold in hand, only a few people will see the risks that come with it. The young lord replied, Not to mention when the majority of people's lives improve, they will not want to go back to the past. You're so sure that investment will produce returns, and that not making ends meet is a common thing. Andrew retorted, once there's a setback at the beginning of the plan, it will be a devastating blow to your entire plan. Brando laughed in his heart. The fact that they were already thinking on his side meant that he had convinced them. After all, this was an innate temptation for druids, and it was almost irresistible. That's why I need you in addition to my experience, he replied, a thorough plan with a bit of luck. Everything has its risks. You can see that individuals often fail because they lack a strong support behind them. This support is the support of the territory, the lord, and even the entire kingdom. Brando thought to himself. In fact, some great lords would occasionally take the initiative to explore new territories. However, with so many enemies, no one dared to invest too much in unknown territory. As a result, this kind of investment was usually a one-time thing that never returned. Over time, apart from the true gamblers, no one was interested in the wilderness anymore. However, this was also because most people did not have a clear understanding of the wilderness. However, he had an advantage, and that was that he knew that his investment would definitely yield returns. This was the advantage of experience. Andrew was silent for a moment before he finally nodded. All right, my lord, you've convinced me. If you can really do all this, what do you need us to do? It's not what I need you to do, Brando replied. It's just that you have to protect the fruits of your labor. You'll understand. In this world, I'm not the only one with ambition. You haven't really seen the greed of other lords. The elder druid nodded. I understand, he replied. I have to say, my lord, you're the best lobbyist I've ever seen. Brendel smiled faintly. He picked up the 2 letters from the table and said, there's one last thing I need to ask of you. Speak. Andrew took a deep breath. Brando's words had even made him a little excited. If he could really do it, then the changes to the entire world of order would be earth-shattering. If the merciful King Eric was the greatest pioneer after the Year of Chaos, then this young man would probably dominate the history of the next era. If he could succeed. Help me deliver these 2 letters. Letters? What are they for? The elder druid asked. Pass through the forest and you'll be able to reach Port Gris from the east. Some of my subordinates are currently there. Brando replied, deliver these letters to a man called Copper Dragon Redo. Copper Dragon is his title, so I'm sure you won't get it wrong. Is there anything else? Andrew took the letters and looked through them. Brendel shook his head. There's nothing else. The only thing left is for time to prove itself. I have other matters to attend to, so I won't be seeing you off. I wish you success, Andrew nodded. Then we'll take our leave. He bowed deeply to the young lord, opened the door and went out. Falerne raised her head and watched the trio leave. She turned around and asked, my lord, are you going to deliver the letters to them as well? Even though she knew that Brando was a meticulous person, she still couldn't help but feel uneasy when it came to strangers. She didn't understand why Brando would trust 3 people he had never met before. Not only did he entrust Sifred to them, he even entrusted them with a matter of life and death. Even if the other party was a druid, what if this identity was fake? Brando naturally couldn't explain the reason to her. He could only explain his knowledge of the druids as a wizard. But on the other hand, he couldn't tell her that he actually knew these people. Where did he meet them? That was more than 10 years later. After the Sacred Stone Conference, he spent a long time raising his prestige in the Witherwood Council. It was all for the sake of clearing the Valhalla ruins. In that era, Grodin was long gone. It was the era when Aween was at its strongest after its resurgence. No one would believe it except for a lunatic. He thought for a moment and replied, Copper Dragon Redo has always been in contact with Freya. It shouldn't be too troublesome to deliver a letter to her. Amandina glared at him. You know that's not what I'm talking about. She snapped, my lord. Brando smiled. Of course I know what you're talking about, Miss Elf. But you have to admit that I know the druids better than you do. Trust me, they're telling the truth. The prophecy of the forest should have appeared a long time ago. The druids' respect for Naya is far beyond what you can imagine. Delivering a letter for me is just a casual activity. I believe that Andrus will treat this as a test. If you don't put yourself in their shoes, it's hard to understand how important this matter is to them. Brendel thought for a while and added, if you don't put yourself in their shoes and consider their values, it's hard to understand how important this matter is to them. But? No buts, Brendel came up with an excuse. Besides, that's a consideration in itself and I have a backup plan. A backup plan? Falerne looked at him suspiciously. Why didn't she know? The 2 letters that Andrus took away were copied by Amandina. She did not believe that Brando had prepared more. After spending so much time together, she was starting to understand the young man. Of course. Brando could not help but look at Falerne, who was expressionless as usual. He paused for a moment and suddenly thought of an idea. How's the inventory? Falerne lowered her head and looked at him with a trace of disdain. Why would he interrupt a girl's conversation like this? Moreover, I'm his summoned creature. Even though she looked down on him, she still opened the book in her hand and answered in a straightforward manner. We've checked the granaries. There are about 50,000 bushels of grain stored in the granaries, enough to support the city for 3 to 4 months. However, the warehouse is basically empty. The stones, iron, and wood are far less than what we've recorded. We can't even find out the exact direction of the outflow. It was normal for the warehouse to be empty. With Grodin's ability, it was already a miracle that he did not turn Abes into a black forest. However, the ones who really needed to thank were the druids in the forest, even though they did not know that there were such people in the forest. Brando shook his head. We have to find a way to solve the stone and wood shortage. Abes is not safe right now. The walls that were damaged in the battle 2 days ago must be repaired and reinforced immediately. He could not help but rub his forehead when he thought of this. In the game's Lord mode, resources were quantified. This method of making it convenient for the players had caused him a lot of trouble. For example, in the game, reinforcing a section of the city walls required 2 units of stone and wood. However, how much would 2 units of stone and wood cost in real life? Brando had no idea. It was a pity that even though Amandina was knowledgeable, she was not omniscient. Especially when it came to matters like this, he would have to ask professional masonry or officials for advice. But the crux of the problem was that Ferber lacked both stonemasons and officials. The captains of the garrison were not willing to work for her, and most of them were recruited by Grodin from the mercenaries. They could not answer these professional questions. In fact, they did not know as much as the Nightsong Tiger, although the Nightsong Tiger was not much better than Amandina. Brando felt a headache coming on when he thought of this problem. He shook his head. In short, how much do we have left? Is it enough to repair the walls? Falerne looked at him and thought, My lord, didn't you ask for it when you cut the southern gate in half in order to show off? However, she replied with an expressionless face, My lord, to put it simply, we don't have. What? If you want to know more about the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the legal reading. Chapter 247. After listening to Falerne's explanation, Brando finally put down the matter at hand and became serious. There are 4 lumber mills and 2 quarries near Abes. How can there not be any reserves? He raised his head, his light brown eyes reflecting Falerne's slender figure. Even if there is no reserves, Grinoires and Randner are the most important provinces in Erewhon, and Tonagel is no exception. As far as I know, there are as many as 7 sawmills in the barony of Ferber alone. Even if we can control 4 of the sawmills near Ferber, it would still be enough to repair and reinforce the city walls within a week. Brendel paused. In the game, the lumber mill's weekly output was 1 unit, and Tonagel's specialty products were doubled. However, that was only in the game and he was not sure if it was the same in real life. My lord, do you know about this? Falerne asked. Of course I do. Brando suppressed his doubts and asked, So what exactly is going on? There are 2 reasons, Falerne said with a straight face. First, the workers in the lumber mill are Grodin's private property, and they are not willing to work for us. What? Because they are afraid of retaliation. In their eyes, my lord is bound to fail sooner or later. After all, your enemy is Count Randner, and you, my lord, are but a fledgling noble. That's reasonable, Brando nodded. Then let's dismiss them. Don't make things difficult for them. Without a sense of security, the people will not follow us. Humans are realistic and no one will believe in empty words. But it's fine, the key to turning the situation around is just around the corner. As long as we get through the first hurdle, our forces will stabilize. Then before that, what about the workers in the lumber mill? Falerne asked in a calm voice. Don't we still have the Senia people? That won't do. What? Because before that, my lord must take back the lumber mill. What? Brando was amused. Could it be that the sawmill is still not under our control? He clearly remembered that the nearest sawmill to Abes was only a few miles away. Could it be that the noble's private army that had escaped from Abes had regrouped outside the city so quickly? In the young lord's impression, the noble's private armies did not seem to have such high combat strength and tactical accomplishments. Pharaoh shook her head and answered him. No, according to what we know, 3 of the 4 lumber mills have already been occupied by the subterranean dwellers. The remaining one was abandoned 5 years ago. Cavemen? Brando asked, aren't they the residents of the lowest level of the underground world? Don't they live under the Georgindy Ridge? Legend has it that the various tribes of the underground world are in endless disputes, and at the same time they are fighting with the demon lords. When did they have the time to come to the surface? There's a crack in the forest that connects Georgindy Ridge to the surface world. Furlough paused for a moment. Captain guessed that it might be a tribe that fled here during the war. Groton doesn't care about it? Brando was a little depressed. He knocked on the table with his knuckles. That's his property. But he suddenly stopped when he saw the elven girl looking at him with her clear green eyes. Her eyes were clearly saying, who knows what those filthy nobles are thinking? He suddenly realized that even though Groton's lackeys were tyrannical and abes, they were a complete mess in terms of combat strength. Even a group of mercenaries led by Brendel could easily defeat them, let alone the subterranean dwellers. In the game, mercenaries were nothing more than miscellaneous weapons in the human world. Even though the subterranean dwellers were the lowest level of residents in Georgindy Ridge, they were also the first official army of the underground kingdom. They were equivalent to crews, the strongest human empire under the Holy Cathedral of Fire. They were at least like cavalry or spearmen, and were the core of the army in the Erewhon kingdom. If Groton wanted to rely on his lackeys to fend off the subterranean dwellers, he would have a headache just defending against them, let alone attacking them. Brando couldn't help but pat his forehead as he cursed himself for being incompetent. However, this realization also reminded him of something. Even though level 1 subterranean dwellers were nothing to him, he had to realize that this was before the Second War of the Black Rose. During this time, the highest level of level 5 subterranean dwellers was only level 1. Unlike the second chapter of the Amber Sword, War and Chaos, where monsters like the great alchemist Tamar emerged one after another, ancient units also appeared in the world, and the ranks of the subterranean dwellers rose like a rocket. It was precisely because of that glorious era that Brendel's vision was so high. Thus, the current wars were like child's play to him. For example, the Insursta Dragon's invasion of Bucci in the future would be considered a border conflict, but in this era, it could be considered a rare war. After all, he only had a few mercenaries under his command. Most of these mercenaries had yet to reach the level of Iron Ranked, and they were considered as the nobles' private soldiers in the Amber Sword. However, in this era, in this place, they were considered the main force of the war. After all, this was Erewhon, not crews of the Eagle Empire. Thinking of this, the young lord stood up. The elven maiden who was holding a book looked at him calmly, but a hint of curiosity flashed in her green eyes. My lord? Follow me. Brando replied. Where are we going? We're going to meet someone. Someone? Falern was startled, unable to follow his train of thought. What's wrong? It's nothing. Brando shook his head and took out the sage slate from the drawer. He then took the sword that the elven maiden handed to him. It was an ordinary magic sword, one of Groton's collection. The Baron was cruel and bloodthirsty, but he was not a brave warrior. It was just that Erewhon's nobles valued martial arts, so he could not help but pretend to be a gentleman. However, all of these items had now become Brando's spoils of war. The young lord weighed the sword in his hand and sighed. It was just an alchemy-grade sword with a black iron label. It could not withstand his full power, but it was slightly better than a common longsword. Every time this happened, he could not help but miss the Thorn of Light. It seemed that ever since he lost that sword, he had not found another weapon that suited him. Although he had many goals in mind, he did not have the time, or the spawn point was not on the way. He put away the sword and added, I just suddenly felt that time was pressing. The elven maiden glanced at him. Soon, the two of them left the study and silently walked along the corridor on the north side of the castle. Brando looked at the elven maiden who was holding the book as if she wanted to say something, but she held back her words and asked, What's wrong? It's nothing. Falern looked at the empty corridor in front of her and replied, It's just that Cabiaz's relic is still with me, my lord. That's right. Brando slapped his forehead. I remember now. What was it that you wanted to ask me last time? Falern lowered her head and rummaged through her pouch for a while before taking out a small object. She looked at Brando's outstretched hand and opened his palm, revealing a diamond-shaped golden object. Brando looked at the heavy object that looked like a golden shuttle and was slightly startled. He immediately blurted out, So it's this. Cabiaz was really lucky. He paused for a moment. No, I should say that I'm really lucky. Falern looked at him with a puzzled expression. This thing is called the Stone of Order. also known as the door stone. It's a good thing. Brando carefully looked at the golden shuttle as if he was afraid that he had misjudged it. It can be used to expand the territory. Expand the territory? Brando withdrew his gaze and looked at the side of the corridor. His gaze landed on the unknown tree in the courtyard and shook his head. I don't know how to explain it to you. The door stone in the amber sword can provide a special attribute to a territory. For example, it can increase the forest's rapid growth, lumber production +1 per week, or increase the workshop's specialization, increase the probability of craftsmen being born in the territory. But he didn't know how these things worked in the game. In any case, this is a rare treasure, but I don't know where that bastard Cabias got it from. He must have snatched it from the nobles in the southern border. Brendel thought for a while and replied, anyway, this is a rare treasure, but I don't know where Cabias got it from. He couldn't help but wonder if he should rob him too. Outburst of luck? Falerne frowned and took out another ring. My lord, this is also one of Cabias's relics. Brendel stopped abruptly. He stared at the emblem on the ring with a sword and shield intersecting. His eyes flashed slightly. Warrior's ring, he said with difficulty, then asked, this is also one of Cabias's relics? Falerne nodded, but when she saw his expression she couldn't help but ask, is it very important? It's more than important. Brando took a deep breath. The warrior's ring, although its name was ordinary, it was just like the knight's ring, the wizard's ring, and even the elementalist's ring. At first glance, people would think that it was a common item that could be found anywhere. If you weren't familiar with its properties, you might be misled by its name. But for players who were familiar with its properties, it was one of the rare priceless treasures in the game. First of all, its level was enough to explain everything. It was a gold item and a fantasy item. Then Brando took a quick glance at its properties and understood. Sure enough, it was exactly the same as it was in the game. For example, the description of the ring could be summarized in one sentence. It was as simple as the properties on the ring. Because it only had one property. Warrior skills +1. P.S. Thanks to Cheba's bloody-soaked fleeting time, Rutiu Little 7, Great Deity, Yang 6655796, and other students for sorting out the data in this book. For now, this is all I can gather. Please contact Blue Knight. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.